In the dusty flatlands of East Texas, where cottonwoods bend to prairie winds and mercy comes as scarce as rain, Clara May Whitfield has learned that some prisons don't have bars. For 20 years, she's endured her husband's cruelty, but nothing prepared her for the night Ezra banished her and their 8-year-old twins to sleep among the hogs. Each evening, as decent folk settle into warm beds, Clara spreads threadbare blankets over straw reeking of mud and waste, whispering prayers that tomorrow might bring deliverance. When wealthy rancher Luke Callahan rides through on the spring cattle drive, he sees something that stops him. Colder woman of quiet dignity, reduced to sheltering her children like livestock. What he doesn't know is that Clara's suffering runs deeper than anyone imagines, and the choice she'll soon face will determine whether love can truly conquer a lifetime of shame. But can a stranger's kindness overcome 20 years of broken promises? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Then pauses. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Whitfield homestead, its golden light doing little to soften the harsh reality of 20 acres that had once held promise. Clara May stood at the edge of the hog pen, her weathered hands gripping the splintered wooden rail as she watched her 8-year-old twins, Mary and Samuel, stirring beneath the faded quilt that had been her grandmother's wedding gift. The fabric, once a vibrant pattern of blue and yellow flowers, now bore the stains of too many nights spent protecting her children from the cold Texas wind that whistled through the gaps in the makeshift shelter. "Mama," Mary's voice carried the sleepy confusion of a child who had grown too accustomed to waking in places that smelled of mud and waste. Her dark hair, so like Clara's own, stuck to her forehead in damp tendrils. "Is it time to get up?" Clara's heart clenched as she forced a smile. "Yes, sweetheart, the sun's climbing, and we've got work to do." She climbed over the low fence, her worn boots squelching in the muck that never seemed to dry completely, no matter how many loads of fresh straw she spread each week. The twins had learned not to complain about the smell, about the way their clothes carried the scent of the pen, even after Clara scrubbed them raw in the creek. They had learned, at 8 years old, to accept what should have been unacceptable. Samuel sat up slowly, his small frame thin despite Clara's best efforts to ensure he and Mary got the larger portions at meals. His eyes, Ezra's pale blue eyeshelled, a solemnity that no child should carry. "Mama, why do we have to sleep out here again?" The question came every few days, though Clara suspected Samuel knew the answer as well as she did. Ezra had made his position clear 6 months ago, when the bank had threatened foreclosure and his drinking had reached a pitch that made him dangerous, even to approach. The house, he'd declared, was for working men, not for the burdens that dragged a man down. Clara and the twins were burdens, mouths to feed, that contributed nothing to the struggle of keeping the land. "Because your papa needs his rest," Clara said gently, the lie tasting bitter on her tongue. She had long since stopped trying to explain Ezra's cruelty in terms that would make sense to children. How could she tell them that their father saw them as failures, as evidence of his own disappointments? How could she explain that every time he looked at them, he saw the dreams that had died with each failed harvest, each note that came due, each morning he woke to find his life smaller than the day before? The homestead sprawled around them, a testament to ambitions that had withered under the relentless Texas sun. The main house, built by Clara's father 30 years ago, still stood solid and proud, its whitewashed walls gleaming in the morning light. The porch that wrapped around 3 sides had been Clara's favorite place as a child, where she'd shelled peas with her mother and listened to her father's stories about the early days of settlement. Now the porch stood empty except for Ezra's chair, positioned to overlook his domain like a throne from which he could survey all that had gone wrong. The barn, once filled with healthy livestock and the sweet smell of hay, now housed only the aging milk cow and a handful of chickens that scratched listlessly in the dust. The fields that had once produced corn and cotton now grew mostly weeds and broken dreams. Ezra still worked them, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. Clara could see it in the way he moved through the rows, his shoulders bent, not just with effort, but with the weight of accumulated failure. It hadn't always been this way. Clara's memory held images of a different man, a different life. She remembered Ezra at 28, tall and broad-shouldered, with calloused hands that had been gentle when they touched her face. He'd courted her properly, sitting on that same porch with her father, talking about crops and weather and the future they would build together. He'd been full of plans then, full of the confidence that came from believing the land would reward hard work and good intentions. Their wedding had been the social event of the season in Millbrook, the small town 5 miles south where the church bells still rang every Sunday and the general store served as the unofficial center of community life. Clara had worn her mother's dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and carried wildflowers picked from the meadow behind the house. Ezra had promised to love and cherish her, to provide for her and any children they might be blessed with. She'd believed him then, believed in the future they would create together. The early years had been good. Not easy farming never was, but good in the way that mattered. They'd worked side by side, Clara tending the vegetable garden and the chickens, while Ezra managed the larger crops. When Mary was born, followed 2 years later by Samuel, Clara had felt the completion of a circle that had begun with her own childhood on this same land. The twins had been healthy, happy babies who grew into curious, bright children, who helped with chores and asked endless questions about everything from why the sky was blue to where the creek water came from. But the land had other plans. 3 years of drought had killed the cotton crop and left the corn stunted and bitter. The bank had been understanding at first, offering extensions and modifications that kept the farm viable. But understanding had limits, and when the 4th year brought flooding that washed away the topsoil and left standing water that bred mosquitoes and disease, even the most patient creditors had begun to make demands. Ezra had changed with each setback, his optimism curdling into resentment. He'd started drinking more, not just the occasional beer after a long day, but steady, purposeful drinking that dulled the edges of his anger without blunting its core. The gentle hands that had once caressed Clara's cheek began to clench into fists. The voice that had once spoken of dreams began to carry the harsh edge of a man who had been betrayed by life itself. The first time he'd struck her, Clara had been so shocked she'd simply stood there, her hand pressed to her stinging cheek, unable to process what had happened. Ezra had been immediately remorseful, gathering her into his arms and promising it would never happen again. He'd been drinking, he'd said. The stress of the bank's latest letter had pushed him beyond reason. It wouldn't happen again. But it had happened again, and again. Each time followed by remorse, by promises, by brief periods of the old Ezra shining through the alcohol and anger. Clara had learned to read the signs that set of his shoulders when he came in from the fields, the particular way he held his head when the drinking had reached the point where words became weapons. She'd learned to keep the twins out of his way, to speak softly and move carefully, to become small and invisible when the storm clouds gathered behind his eyes. The night he'd banished them to the hog pen, Clara had known something fundamental had shifted. It hadn't been anger that drove him. Anger was hot and immediate and burned itself out. This had been something colder, more calculated. He'd looked at his family as if they were strangers, as if he was seeing them clearly for the first time and finding them wanting. "You're the reason," he'd said, his voice steady despite the whiskey on his breath. "You and them. Every time I look at you, I see what I've lost. Every time I hear their voices, I remember what I used to hope for." He'd gestured toward the pen with the same leather work belt he'd once worn proudly to church. "Maybe if you understand what you've cost me, you'll find a way to make it right." That had been 6 months ago. 6 months of nights spent in the pen, of mornings when Clara woke with straw in her hair and the twins' questions growing harder to answer. 6 months of watching her children adapt to circumstances that should have been unthinkable, of seeing them lose pieces of their childhood to the necessity of survival. "Mama, I'm hungry," Mary said, sitting up and rubbing her eyes. The simple statement carried no complaint, no demand, just the quiet acceptance of a child who had learned that hunger was as much a part of life as breathing. "I know, baby girl," Clara said, reaching out to smooth Mary's tangled hair. "Let's get you both cleaned up, and then we'll see about breakfast." The ritual of morning was familiar now, carved into routine by necessity. Clara would lead the twins to the creek behind the house, where they would wash their faces and hands in the cold water that ran year-round from the spring up in the hills. She would braid Mary's hair and help Samuel comb his with the wooden comb that had belonged to Clara's father. They would brush the straw from their clothes and try to make themselves presentable for another day of maintaining the pretense that their situation was temporary, that things would get better, that this was just a rough patch in a life that would eventually return to normal. The creek was Clara's favorite place on the property, the one spot that seemed untouched by the family's troubles. Willows drooped their branches into the water, creating a natural curtain that provided privacy and the illusion of a world apart from the harsh realities of the homestead. Clara had played here as a child, built dams with her father, learned to swim in the deeper pools downstream. Now she brought her own children here, trying to give them some small piece of the wonder she remembered from her own childhood. "Look, Mama," Samuel said, pointing to a family of ducks that had settled in the shallows near the far bank. "They're teaching their babies to swim." Clara followed his gaze and smiled at the sight of the mother duck, her brown feathers gleaming in the morning sun, paddling slowly while her ducklings followed in a ragged line behind her. "Yes, they are. That's what good mothers do. They teach their children what they need to know to survive." The words carried more weight than Clara had intended, and she saw something flicker in Samuel's eyes, understanding that was both too young and too old for his 8 years. He knew, as children often do, that there were lessons being taught in their current situation that went beyond the obvious. He was learning about endurance, about dignity in the face of humiliation, about the ways that love could persist, even when everything else had been stripped away. Mary, splashing her hands in the water, seemed oblivious to the deeper currents of the conversation. She was still young enough to find joy in simple things, the feel of cool water on her skin, the sight of sunlight dancing on the surface of the creek, the sound of her mother's voice reading to them from the Bible they kept hidden in the pen beneath the loose floorboard that only Clara knew about. "Will we always live in the pen, Mama?" Samuel asked, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a child who had learned that some questions were dangerous. Clara knelt beside him, her hands stilling on the fabric of his shirt as she considered her answer. She had made a promise to herself never to lie to her children, but she had also learned that truth was sometimes too heavy a burden for young shoulders. "I don't know, Samuel," she said finally, "but I know that we'll always be together, no matter where we sleep, and I know that you and Mary are the most important things in my life, more important than any house or any comfort." It wasn't the answer he wanted, she could see that in the way his shoulders sagged slightly, but it was the only honest answer she could give. Clara had no plan for escape, no vision of a future that didn't include the pen and the straw and the constant careful navigation of Ezra's moods. She had learned to measure her days in smaller increments, the successful completion of morning chores, the twins' laughter during their evening Bible stories, the moments of peace that came when Ezra was too drunk to notice them or too focused on his own misery to add to theirs. The sound of horses approaching brought Clara's head up sharply. Visitors were rare at the Whitfield homestead, and unexpected visitors usually meant trouble. She gathered the twins close, her body tensing as she listened to the rhythm of hoofbeats on the packed earth of the main road that ran past their property. "Stay close," she murmured to Mary and Samuel, though she knew they would regardless. The twins had learned to be cautious around strangers, to let Clara do the talking, to disappear quickly if voices were raised or if Ezra's temper began to flare. Through the screen of willows, Clara could see a small group of riders approaching the house. Even from a distance, she could tell they were cowboys, their silhouettes shaped by wide-brimmed hats and the easy way they sat their horses. Spring cattle drive, she realized. The herds would be moving through the area now, heading north to the railheads in Kansas and Colorado. It was a familiar sight, though one that always filled Clara with a mixture of longing and regret. The Cowboys represented freedom, movement, the ability to leave troubles behind and start fresh in a new place. The lead rider was tall and broad-shouldered, sitting his horse with the confidence of a man who had spent more years in the saddle than on the ground. Even from the creek, Clara could see the quality of his girth-tooled leather of his saddle, the silver conchos that caught the morning light, the well-kept rifle that rested in its scabbard. This was no ordinary cowhand, but a man of substance, someone with the authority to negotiate on behalf of the outfit he represented. "Mama, who are they?" Mary whispered, her small hand finding Clara's and holding tight. "Cowboys," Clara said, though something in her chest told her this was more significant than the usual request for water or directions. Probably looking to buy supplies or arrange for feed. The riders had stopped at the house now, and Clara could see Ezra emerging from the front door, his gait already unsteady despite the early hour. He'd been drinking since dawn, she realized, fortifying himself for another day of managing his failures. The sight filled her with familiar dread. Ezra was at his most unpredictable when he was drinking, his anger more likely to spill over into violence, his words more likely to cut deep and leave lasting wounds. The lead cowboy dismounted with fluid grace, his boots hitting the ground with the solid thud of a man who was comfortable in his own skin. He was older than Clara had first thought, perhaps 60, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into the sun. But his movements were those of a younger man, and there was something in his bearing that suggested strength held in reserve, power that didn't need to announce itself to be recognized. "Time to go back," Clara said, though every instinct told her to stay hidden by the creek, to avoid whatever confrontation was building between Ezra and the strangers. But the twins needed breakfast, and she had chores that couldn't wait, and hiding would only make things worse when Ezra discovered her absence. They walked back toward the house in silence, the twins flanking Clara like small guards. As they approached, Clara could hear the rise and fall of voices, Ezra's, with its familiar edge of defensive hostility, the cowboy's deeper and more measured, carrying the authority of a man who was accustomed to being heard. "Looking for feed," the cowboy was saying as Clara and the twins came within earshot. "Got a herd of about 800 head, and we're running low on grain. Heard you might have some to sell." Ezra's laugh was bitter. "Might have some, might not. Depends on what you're willing to pay, and whether you're the type to take advantage of a man's circumstances." The cowboy's expression didn't change, but Clara caught something in his eyes, a flicker of assessment that took in Ezra's unsteady stance, the defensive set of his shoulders, the underlying desperation that colored his every interaction with the outside world. "I pay fair prices for good feed," he said simply. "No more, no less." "Fair." Ezra spat the word as if it tasted bad. "Nothing's been fair about this place for years, but I suppose you'll want to see what I've got before you make any promises." It was then that the cowboy's gaze found Clara and the twins, and she saw his expression change. Not dramatically, he was too experienced for that, but she caught the slight widening of his eyes, the almost imperceptible straightening of his shoulders. He was taking in their appearance, she realized, noting the straw in Mary's hair, the stains on Samuel's clothes, the way they stood close together, as if drawing strength from proximity. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that was both polite and respectful. "I'm Luther Callahan, but most folks call me Luke. These your children?" The simple courtesy in his voice nearly undid Clara. It had been so long since a stranger had spoken to her with basic human respect that she felt tears threaten behind her eyes. "Yes, sir," she managed. "Mary and Samuel." "Fine. Looking children," Luke said, and Clara could tell he meant it. "They favor you." Ezra's voice cut through the moment like a blade. "You here to buy feed or to make social calls? Because if it's the latter, you're wasting your time. We don't get many visitors, and we don't encourage them." Luke's attention returned to Ezra, but Clara could feel his awareness of her and the twins like a physical presence. "Feed," he said, "though I'd say any man with a family like that has reason to be proud." The compliment hung in the air between them, and Clara saw Ezra's face darken with an emotion she couldn't quite identify. Shame, perhaps, or anger at being judged by a stranger. His hand moved to the leather work belt at his waist, the same belt he'd used to gesture toward the pen 6 months ago, the same belt that had become a symbol of his authority and her submission. "You don't know anything about my family," Ezra said, his voice carrying a warning that made Clara's stomach tighten with familiar dread. "And you don't know anything about what it takes to survive in this country. Pretty words don't fill empty bellies or pay banknotes." Luke's expression remained neutral, but Clara caught something in his eyes that made her think he understood more than Ezra realized. "No, sir, they don't. But respect costs nothing, and it's worth more than most folks understand." The words hit their mark, and Clara saw Ezra's face flush with anger. This was how it always started, with someone challenging his authority, questioning his decisions, making him feel small and defensive. Clara knew she should intervene, should find a way to smooth over the confrontation before it escalated, but she found herself frozen by the unexpected gift of Luke's recognition, his simple acknowledgement that she and the twins were worthy of consideration. "You want to see the feed or not?" Ezra asked, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. Luke nodded, though his gaze lingered on Clara for a moment longer. "Yes, sir, I'd appreciate that." As the men walked toward the barn, Clara found herself watching Luke's broad shoulders, noting the way he moved with confidence and purpose. There was something about him that reminded her of her father, not in appearance, but in the quality of his presence, the sense that here was a man who could be trusted, who would keep his word once given. "Mama," Mary tugged at Clara's skirt, her voice small and uncertain. "Why was that man nice to us?" The question pierced Clara's heart because it revealed how unusual simple kindness had become in their lives. "Because some people are just naturally kind, sweetheart," she said, smoothing Mary's hair. "There are still good people in the world." "Will he come back?" Samuel asked, and Clara heard the hope in his voice that he was trying so hard to hide. "I don't know," Clara said honestly, "but we'll remember his kindness, won't we? We'll remember that there are people who see us as worthy of respect." The twins nodded solemnly, and Clara knew that Luke Callahan had given them something precious, a glimpse of how they should be treated, a reminder that their current circumstances were not normal or acceptable. It was a dangerous gift, because it made their present situation seem even more unbearable, but it was also a necessary one. From the barn, Clara could hear the sound of voices, though she couldn't make out the words. Whatever negotiation was taking place, she hoped it would end quickly and without incident. Ezra was unpredictable when he felt cornered, and the presence of witnesses didn't always prevent him from lashing out. As if summoned by her thoughts, Ezra's voice rose in anger, carrying clearly across the yard. "Don't need your charity or your pity. I can take care of my own family without help from strangers." Clara's heart sank. Whatever had happened in the barn, it had triggered Ezra's pride and his defensiveness. She gathered the twins closer, preparing for the storm that would surely follow Luke's departure. Ezra would need someone to blame for his embarrassment, someone to bear the brunt of his anger, and Clara had long since learned that she and the children were the most convenient targets. The barn door opened, and Luke emerged first, his expression carefully neutral. Ezra followed, his face flushed with drink and anger, his hands clenched at his sides. The negotiation had not gone well. "Think about what I said," Luke called over his shoulder as he walked toward his horse. "The offer stands." "Don't need to think about it," Ezra shot back. "And don't need you coming around here again, filling my family's heads with ideas above their station. We managed just fine, without interference from outsiders." Luke paused at his horse, his hand resting on the saddle horn. For a moment, Clara thought he might respond to Ezra's hostility, might push back against the dismissal. Instead, he simply mounted his horse with the same fluid grace he'd shown in dismounting, settling into the saddle as if he belonged there. "Ma'am," he said, touching his hat brim again as his gaze found Clara's, "it was a pleasure meeting you and your children. You take care of yourselves." The words were simple, but Clara heard the layers beneath them, the recognition of her situation, the promise of help if she ever needed it, the assurance that she was not forgotten. She managed a small nod, not daring to speak for fear of triggering Ezra's anger. As Luke and his men rode away, Clara felt something shift inside her chest, a stirring of hope that she had thought long dead. For the first time in months, she had been seen not as a burden or a failure, but as a woman worthy of respect. The twins had been recognized not as obstacles to their father's success, but as the blessings they should have been. But hope was a luxury Clara couldn't afford, and she knew that Ezra's anger would need an outlet. As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, she braced herself for the storm that was coming, gathering the twins close and preparing to shield them from their father's rage. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the dew and promising another day of struggle. But something had changed in the span of a single conversation, something that Clara couldn't quite name but could feel in her bones. Luther Callahan had seen them, really seen them, and that recognition had planted a seed that might grow into something more. 3 days passed before Luke Callahan returned to the Whitfield homestead, and when he did, he brought with him a determination that had been building since his first glimpse of Clara and the twins sleeping among the hogs. The silver pocket watch in his vest, a final gift from his beloved wife Sarah, before consumption claimed her, 5 years ago, had been measuring the hours of his restlessness, marking time until he could find a legitimate reason to check on the family that had haunted his thoughts. Luke had built his fortune through careful observation and decisive action, qualities that had served him well in everything from cattle trading to land acquisition. But it was his capacity for empathy, inherited from Sarah's gentle influence, that had made him unable to forget the sight of a woman and children reduced to circumstances that would shame a civilized society. The watch had belonged to Sarah's father, a Methodist minister who had taught that every soul was precious in God's sight. And Luke could almost hear the old man's voice, reminding him that witnessing suffering without action was a form of complicity. The morning was crisp, with the promise of spring rain, when Luke rode up the familiar path to the Whitfield property. This time he came alone, having left his men with the cattle herd that was bedded down near the creek, 5 miles south. He carried legitimate business. Ezra's feed had been adequate, though overpriced, and Luke genuinely needed to discuss the possibility of grazing rights on the back 40 that bordered the creek. But if he was honest with himself, business was secondary to the need to see Clara and the twins again, to assure himself that his memory hadn't exaggerated their desperate circumstances. As he approached the house, Luke's trained eye took in details that spoke to the homestead's decline. The front gate hung askew on rusted hinges, and several fence posts leaned at angles that suggested they'd been weakened by rot and neglect. The vegetable garden that should have been thriving in the spring sunshine was choked with weeds, and the chicken coop's wire mesh bore holes that would have let in every fox and coyote within miles. This was a place where hope had been deferred so long that it had nearly died altogether. The sound of raised voices from behind the house made Luke's jaw tighten with familiar anger. He'd grown up poor in Arkansas, the son of a sharecropper who'd drunk away more opportunities than he'd ever seized, and he recognized the particular tone of a man taking out his failures on those too weak to fight back. Luke dismounted quickly, tying his horse to the porch rail with hands that had learned steadiness through years of practice, but now trembled slightly with suppressed rage. Following the sound of voices, Luke rounded the corner of the house and stopped short at a scene that burned itself into his memory with crystalline clarity. Clara knelt beside the creek, her dress soaked to the knees as she tried to rinse mud from a small bucket. Ezra stood over her, his leather work belt doubled in his hand, his face flushed with the particular color that came from morning drinking mixed with afternoon rage. "Told you to stay away from the front of the house when decent folk might see you," Ezra was saying, his voice carrying the cold fury that Luke recognized as more dangerous than hot anger. "But you can't seem to understand simple instructions, can you? Maybe this will help you remember." The belt rose, and Clara's shoulders hunched in anticipation of the blow that Luke knew would leave marks hidden beneath her dress. The twins huddled near a willow tree, their faces white with the terror of children who had seen this scene played out too many times before. Mary had her arm around Samuel, and both children pressed themselves against the tree trunk as if they could disappear into the bark itself. "That's enough." Luke's voice cut through the morning air with the authority of a man who had commanded respect in boardrooms and cattle camps across 3 states. "Step away from her." Ezra spun around, the belt still gripped in his fist, his face cycling through surprise, embarrassment, and then settling on defiant anger. "This is private property, Callahan, and private business. You've got no call to interfere in family matters." Luke walked closer, his movements deliberate and controlled. He'd learned long ago that the threat of violence was often more effective than violence itself, and everything about his posture conveyed readiness for whatever might come next. "Any man who raises his hand to a woman loses the right to call it family business. Now step away." "You don't understand the situation here," Ezra said, but Luke noticed he lowered the belt slightly. "She's got to learn her place, got to understand that there are consequences for stepping out of line. A man's got a right to maintain order in his own household." Clara had scrambled to her feet during the exchange, her wet dress clinging to her legs as she moved protectively toward the twins. Luke saw her glance between the 2 men, her face pale with the knowledge that this confrontation would have consequences long after Luke rode away. She was calculating, he realized, trying to determine whether his intervention would ultimately make things better or worse for her and the children. "Mrs. Whitfield," Luke said, his voice gentling as he addressed her directly. "Are you all right?" The simple question seemed to undo her more than Ezra's threatened violence had. Clara's composure cracked for just a moment, and Luke saw tears threaten before she blinked them back. "I'm fine, Mr. Callahan. Just clumsy with the water bucket." Luke's heart broke a little more at her automatic defense of the man who had been about to strike her. He'd seen it before, the way victims protected their abusers, the complex dance of survival that required minimizing and excusing behavior that should have been unthinkable. His Sarah had worked with the church's charity committee, visiting families in need, and she'd taught him to recognize the signs of a woman trapped by circumstances and isolation. "Seems to me you were just trying to fetch water for your family," Luke said carefully. "Nothing clumsy about that." Ezra's anger flared again, and he stepped closer to Luke, with the swagger of a man who'd convinced himself that aggression could substitute for actual power. "You calling me a liar, Callahan? Because if you are, we can settle this right here and now." Luke's hand moved almost imperceptibly closer to the gun at his hip, a gesture that Ezra couldn't have missed. "I'm saying that every person deserves to be treated with dignity, especially in their own home. And I'm saying that anyone who thinks otherwise might need to reconsider their position." The threat hung in the air between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Luke had the advantage of sobriety, training, and the moral authority that came from defending the defenseless. More importantly, he had the backing of wealth and social position that would make any violence on Ezra's part a matter for the law rather than a private dispute. Ezra seemed to realize this because he stepped back slightly, though his grip on the belt remained white-knuckled. "This is still my land, and they're still my family. You can't just ride in here and start making demands." "I'm not making demands," Luke said evenly. "I'm making observations, and what I observe is a woman and children who deserve better than what they're getting." Clara spoke then, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying across the tense silence like a prayer. "Please, Mr. Callahan, you don't understand how things are here. It's better if you just conduct your business and go." Luke heard the fear beneath her words, the knowledge that his presence was making her situation more precarious rather than safer. But he also heard something else say, tiny note of hope, as if some part of her was desperate for someone to see her suffering and name it for what it was. "What business?" Ezra demanded, seizing on the excuse to redirect the conversation away from his treatment of his family. "You said you needed feed, and I sold you feed. What more do you want?" Luke forced himself to focus on the practical matter at hand, though every instinct screamed at him to gather Clara and the twins and remove them from this place immediately. "Grazing rights," he said. "That back 40 near the creek, it's not being used, and I could pay good money for the right to graze my cattle there for a week or two." The mention of money had the desired effect on Ezra, who straightened with the sudden interest of a man perpetually in need of cash. "How much money?" "Depends on the condition of the grass and the access to water," Luke said. "I'd need to take a look around, assess the situation properly." Ezra glanced toward Clara and the twins, then back at Luke, clearly weighing his options. His desire for the money warred with his reluctance to have Luke lingering on the property, asking questions and making judgments. Finally, greed won out over pride. "Fine," Ezra said, sliding the belt back through the loops of his pants. "But this is a business arrangement, nothing more. You look at the land, we agree on a price, and then you move your cattle through and leave us be." "Understood," Luke said, though his definition of leaving them be might differ significantly from Ezra's. "Mrs. Whitfield, would you and the children like to come along? You probably know the property better than anyone." It was a calculated risk, inviting Clara to join them, but Luke wanted her away from the isolation of the creek, where Ezra might feel free to resume his intimidation. Clara looked uncertainly at her husband, clearly recognizing the danger in accepting Luke's invitation, but also understanding that refusing might provoke its own consequences. "She's got work to do," Ezra said quickly. "Women's work, not something that concerns cattle grazing." "I'm sure she does," Luke agreed. "But I find that people who actually live on the land often know things that escape the casual observer. Seasonal flooding patterns, wildlife behavior, soil quality knowledge that comes from daily observation." The flattery was deliberate, positioning Clara's potential contribution as practical rather than social. Luke had learned that men like Ezra were more likely to accept challenges to their authority if those challenges were framed in terms of profit rather than principle. Clara spoke before Ezra could object again. "I could show you where the grass is best," she said quietly, "and where the creek runs deepest in the summer." Luke saw the courage it took for her to speak up, to assert her own value in the face of Ezra's clear displeasure. "That would be helpful, ma'am, thank you." As they walked toward the back of the property, Luke found himself positioned between Clara and Ezra, an arrangement that felt both natural and necessary. The twins trailed behind, silent but alert, their presence a constant reminder of what was at stake in this careful dance of business and confrontation. The back 40 was better than Luke had expected, rolling grassland that would provide good grazing, with the creek meandering through it in lazy curves that created natural watering holes. Under different circumstances, it would have been an ideal arrangement for both parties. Ezra would get much-needed income, and Luke would get quality grazing for his cattle without having to push them further north. But circumstances were far from ideal, and Luke found himself studying Clara as much as the land. She walked with the careful posture of a woman accustomed to making herself small, but her knowledge of the property was extensive and precise. She pointed out areas where the grass was particularly thick, warned about spots where heavy rain made the ground boggy, and identified the best crossing points where cattle could reach the water without damaging the creek banks. "You know this land well," Luke observed, genuinely impressed by her expertise. "I grew up here," Clara said, a note of wistfulness creeping into her voice. "My father taught me to read the signs which way the water flows in heavy rain, where the good grass grows, how to tell if the soil will hold up under heavy use." "Your father sounds like a wise man." He was. Clara's voice grew softer. "He always said the land would take care of you if you took care of it. That partnership was more important than ownership." Ezra snorted derisively. "Pretty sentiment, but it doesn't pay the bills. The bank doesn't care about partnership, they care about payments, and payments require profit." Luke heard the bitterness in Ezra's voice, the resentment of a man who felt betrayed by promises that had never been explicitly made. But he also heard something else: fear. Ezra was afraid of losing the land, afraid of being revealed as a failure, afraid of admitting that he didn't have the knowledge or skill to make the homestead profitable. Sometimes profit comes from unexpected sources, Luke said carefully. Good grazing land, for instance. Properly managed, this 40 acres could provide steady income without requiring significant investment. The seed was planted deliberately. Luke was beginning to formulate a plan that went beyond simple business arrangements, a way to provide Clara and the twins with security while giving Ezra a face-saving path toward better treatment of his family. It would require careful maneuvering and considerable patience, but Luke had both in abundance when the stakes mattered. As they completed their survey of the property, Luke found himself watching the twins as much as their parents. Mary and Samuel moved with the wariness of children who had learned that safety was temporary and danger could emerge without warning. But they also showed flashes of curiosity and intelligence that spoke to their resilience and their mother's influence. These were children who, given the chance, could thrive. The negotiation for the grazing rights proceeded smoothly, with Luke offering a fair price that was slightly higher than Ezra had dared to hope for. Money changed hands, agreements were made, and Luke's cattle would begin using the pasture within the week. But as they walked back toward the house, Luke knew that the real business was just beginning. Standing beside his horse, Luke pulled out the silver pocket watch and checked the timid gesture that gave him a moment to consider his next words carefully. The watch had been Sarah's way of reminding him that every moment mattered, that opportunities for kindness were fleeting and should never be wasted. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, addressing Clara directly despite Ezra's visible displeasure, "if you or the children ever need anything at all, my ranch is just 12 miles north of town. Anyone in Millbrook can tell you how to find it." The offer was deliberately vague, phrased as general neighborliness rather than specific rescue. But Clara understood its deeper meaning. Luke saw recognition flicker in her eyes, followed immediately by fear as she glanced toward Ezra. "That's generous of you, Mr. Callahan," she said carefully, "but we manage just fine on our own." "I'm sure you do," Luke replied, mounting his horse with fluid grace. "But sometimes managing isn't the same as thriving, and everyone deserves the chance to thrive." As he rode away from the Whitfield homestead, Luke carried with him the image of Clara and the twins standing in the yard, their figures growing smaller but not less significant in his memory. The silver watch ticked steadily against his chest, marking time until he could find a way to keep the promise he'd made to Sarah's memory that he would never turn away from suffering when he had the power to alleviate it. The inciting incident had occurred not in a single moment of violence, but in the accumulation of small cruelties and the recognition that intervention was not just possible but necessary. Luke Callahan had seen enough, and now the question was not whether he would act, but how quickly and effectively he could bring about change for a family that had suffered in silence for far too long. That evening, as Clara settled the twins into their makeshift bed in the hog pen, her hands trembled as she arranged the threadbare blankets with extra care. Hidden beneath the loose floorboard near the corner post lay her most precious possession, a small wicker sewing basket that had belonged to her mother. Inside, wrapped in faded blue cloth, were the remnants of a life she'd almost forgotten, a few silver thimbles, spools of thread in colors that had once brightened her days, and a packet of needles sharp enough to pierce through the toughest fabric. More importantly, the basket held her few remaining coins, saved one by one from egg sales and mending work, and a daguerreotype of her parents on their wedding day. The sewing basket represented everything Clara had been before Ezra's cruelty reduced her to a woman who slept among animals. She had been skilled with a needle, capable of creating beautiful things that brought joy to their household. Her mother had taught her to embroider wildflowers on pillowcases, to darn socks so skillfully that the repair was nearly invisible, to alter dresses so that hand-me-downs looked tailored for their new owners. Clara's reputation for fine sewing had once brought customers from as far as Millbrook, women who trusted her to create christening gowns and wedding dresses that would become family heirlooms. "Mama, why did that nice man come back?" Mary asked, her voice muffled by the old quilt as she snuggled closer to Samuel. The twins had developed the habit of sleeping pressed together, drawing comfort from shared warmth and the security of knowing they weren't alone in their strange circumstances. Clara considered her answer carefully. The children had been unusually quiet since Luke's visit, and she could see the wheels turning in their young minds as they tried to process what they'd witnessed. They'd never seen anyone stand up to their father before, never heard anyone suggest that their living situation might not be acceptable. "Mr. Callahan needed to look at our land for his cattle," Clara said, smoothing Mary's hair with gentle strokes. "Sometimes business requires more than one conversation." He was angry at Papa, Samuel observed with the uncomfortable clarity that children often possessed. But he wasn't mean angry, he was the other kind. Clara's heart clenched at her son's wisdom. Samuel had learned to distinguish between different types of anger because his survival depended on reading the emotional weather of the adults around him. He understood the difference between righteous indignation and cruel rage, even if he lacked the vocabulary to name these concepts properly. "Sometimes good people get upset when they see things that aren't right," Clara said carefully. "That doesn't make them mean sometimes, it makes them want to help." The words felt dangerous, even as she spoke them, because they contained a truth she'd been trying to avoid acknowledging. Luke Callahan had been upset on their behalf, and that upset had translated into protection rather than additional violence. For the first time in years, someone had defended her, had placed himself between her and harm without asking for anything in return. "Will he help us?" Mary asked with the devastating hope of a child who still believed that adults could fix broken things. Clara closed her eyes against the wave of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. How could she explain that help might come with a price too terrible to pay? That Ezra's reaction to Luke's interference had been temporarily muted by the presence of a witness, but that the reckoning would come later, in the dark hours, when no one could see or hear what happened to families who stepped out of line. "I don't know, sweetheart," Clara said honestly. "But I know that we have each other, and that's the most important thing." It was the same answer she always gave, the safe answer that didn't promise more than she could deliver. But tonight it felt different, weighted with possibilities that hadn't existed that morning. Luke's business card, pressed into her hand during a moment when Ezra had been distracted by calculating potential profits, lay hidden in the sewing basket beneath the floorboard. She hadn't looked at it since hiding it there, but she could feel its presence like a warm coal against her ribs. As the twins finally settled into sleep, Clara allowed herself to remember what it felt like to be seen as something other than an inconvenience. Luke had addressed her by name, had valued her knowledge, had spoken to her as if her opinions mattered. The simple respect in his voice had awakened parts of herself that she'd thought permanently silenced by years of systematic diminishment. The sound of boots on the porch made Clara's stomach tighten with familiar dread. Ezra was coming, and his gait suggested he'd been drinking steadily since Luke's departure. Clara quickly checked that the twins were settled, then positioned herself near the pen's entrance, ready to intercept whatever anger Ezra needed to discharge. "Clara," his voice carried across the yard, deceptively calm, "come here." Clara climbed over the low fence, her movements careful and non-threatening. She'd learned to read Ezra's moods like a barometer, and everything about his posture tonight suggested a storm-building pressure. The afternoon's humiliation being corrected in front of a stranger, having his authority questioned, being forced to negotiate rather than dictate, would need an outlet. "Yes, Ezra?" He stood silhouetted against the lamplight spilling from the house, his hands hanging loose at his sides in a way that might have looked relaxed to an untrained observer. But Clara could see the tension in his shoulders, the particular way he held his head when violence was brewing beneath his surface calm. "That man," Ezra said, his voice conversational. "Callahan, what did you think of him?" The question was a trap, and Clara knew it. Praise Luke, and she would be accused of disloyalty or worse. Criticize him, and she would be lying in a way that might somehow make things worse. Her only safe path lay in neutrality so complete that it offered no foothold for Ezra's anger. "I didn't think much of anything," she said carefully. "He seemed like a businessman interested in grazing rights." Is that all? Ezra stepped closer, and Clara caught the sharp scent of whiskey on his breath. Because it seemed to me like he took quite an interest in you and the children. Made quite a point of including you in the conversation. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her voice steady. He asked about the land because I grew up here. I know where the good grass grows. Your father's daughter? Ezra said, and the words carried an edge of contempt that made Clara flinch. Always ready with practical information, always sure she knows better than her husband about how things should be managed. The accusation was unfair, and they both knew it, but fairness had long since ceased to be a consideration in their interactions. Ezra needed to re-establish his dominance after the afternoon's challenges, and Clara's supposed overconfidence was as good an excuse as any. I only answered the questions I was asked, Clara said quietly. I didn't presume to know better than anyone. Didn't you? Ezra's hand moved to his belt, not quite threatening but close enough to make Clara's breath catch. Because it seemed to me like you were quite eager to show off your knowledge, quite pleased to have someone appreciate your insights. Clara said nothing, recognizing that any response would only provide additional ammunition. Ezra was working himself up to something, building a case for whatever punishment he'd already decided to inflict. The specific crime mattered less than his need to reassert control. You embarrassed me today, Ezra said, his voice dropping to the dangerous whisper that always preceded his worst behavior, standing there like some kind of expert, making me look like I don't know my own land. That wasn't my intention. Don't. The word cracked like a whip, silencing Clara instantly. Don't lie to me. I saw how you looked at him, how you perked up when he treated you like you had something valuable to say. You liked it, didn't you? Liked having a man pay attention to you. The accusation hit Clara like a physical blow, not because it was true, but because it revealed how completely Ezra misunderstood her motivations. She hadn't been seeking male attention, she'd been starved for basic human respect, for acknowledgement that she existed as something more than a burden to be endured. You're wrong, Clara said, though she knew the denial would only inflame his suspicions. I was only trying to be helpful. Helpful, Ezra laughed bitterly. Is that what you call it when a woman makes eyes at a stranger in front of her own husband? Clara stared at him in genuine bewilderment, making eyes. She'd barely dared to look directly at Luke, had spent most of the afternoon studying her own hands or watching the twins. But she recognized the futility of arguing against accusations that existed primarily in Ezra's imagination, fed by whiskey and wounded pride. I won't have it, Ezra continued, his voice gaining strength as he warmed to his theme. I won't have my wife making a fool of me in front of strangers, acting like she's available for any man who shows her a moment's kindness. The injustice of it burned in Clara's throat like bile. 20 years of fidelity, of putting his needs before her own, of subjugating her own desires to his requirements, and he could still accuse her of impropriety based on nothing more than her ability to answer questions about land she'd known since childhood. That's not what happened, she said, her voice barely audible. Isn't it? Ezra's smile was cruel in the lamplight. Then explain to me why he made such a point of offering help if you need it. Men don't make offers like that to women who aren't sending signals. Clara's mind reeled as she tried to process this interpretation of Luke's kindness. In Ezra's world, apparently, no act of generosity could exist without ulterior motives. No kindness could be offered without expectation of reward. The possibility that Luke had simply been moved by compassion, that he'd offered help because he'd recognized suffering and felt compelled to alleviate it, seemed beyond Ezra's comprehension. He was being neighborly, Clara said weakly, though she could hear how unconvincing her own voice sounded. Neighborly. Ezra spat the word like a curse. Is that what you're going to tell people when you run off with the first rich man who shows you attention, that you were just being neighborly? The accusation was so far from Clara's reality that for a moment she could only stare at him in shock. Run off? She could barely manage to keep her children fed, and safe the idea that she could somehow engineer an escape from her circumstances was ludicrous. But she could see that Ezra genuinely believed his own story, had convinced himself that Clara was capable of betrayal, of abandonment, of actions that required a kind of agency she hadn't possessed in years. "I would never," Clara began, but Ezra cut her off with a gesture. "You would never what? Leave your husband, abandon your responsibilities? Because it seems to me like you're already halfway there, filling your head with romantic notions about rescue and redemption." Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach as she realized that Ezra had identified her secret hope and named it correctly. She had been thinking about rescue, had allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to live without fear, to sleep in a clean bed, to watch her children grow up in safety. Luke's kindness had awakened possibilities she'd thought were dead, and somehow Ezra had recognized that awakening as a threat. "The children need me," Clara said, grasping for solid ground in an argument that seemed to shift with every exchange. "I would never leave the children." "Wouldn't you?" Ezra's voice carried a note of genuine curiosity, as if he was testing a theory. "Even if someone offered you a better life? Even if someone promised to take care of all three of you?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Clara was afraid to examine too closely. How had Ezra known that Luke's offer had encompassed more than just emergency assistance? Had something in her expression given away the scope of her hopes? "There is no better life," Clara said finally, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "This is my life. You are my husband. The children are my responsibility." It was the answer Ezra wanted to hear, the complete submission that would allow him to believe his authority remained unchallenged. But Clara could see from his expression that her capitulation had brought him no satisfaction. If anything, he seemed disappointed, as if he'd been hoping for a fight that would justify more severe punishment. "See that you remember that," he said finally, his hand moving away from his belt. "And see that you don't give Callahan or anyone else reason to think you're available for rescue. Because the only thing worse than a faithless wife is a woman who can't recognize her own good fortune." As Ezra turned back toward the house, Clara remained standing in the yard, her body trembling with the aftermath of confrontation narrowly avoided. She understood now that Luke's kindness had created a new kind of danger, that her glimpse of respect and dignity had been noticed and catalogued as potential rebellion. Any future contact with Luke would have to be carefully managed. Any hope of change would have to be hidden so completely that even she could pretend it didn't exist. But as Clara climbed back into the hog pen and settled beside her sleeping children, she found herself unable to forget the feeling of being seen as worthy of protection. Luke's business card remained hidden in the sewing basket, and with it the knowledge that somewhere in the world someone believed she deserved better than what she had. It was a dangerous knowledge, but it was also a powerful one, and Clara held it close, like a secret flame that might, if carefully tended, eventually grow into something bright enough to light her way out of the darkness. Samuel's wooden horse had been carved by Clara's father during the winter before his death, when arthritis had kept him indoors and given him time to work the soft pine into a toy that captured the spirit of the wild mustangs that still roamed the distant hills. The horse was no bigger than Samuel's palm, its mane and tail carved with delicate precision, its legs positioned in mid-gallop as if frozen in a moment of pure freedom. Clara's father had presented it to Samuel on his 6th birthday, telling him that horses were symbols of independence and strength, creatures that could carry a man to new places when the old places no longer served him well. Now, 2 years later, Samuel clutched the wooden horse as he sat beside the creek, his 8-year-old mind wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. The horse had become his talisman, a reminder of his grandfather's stories about adventure and possibility, but also a symbol of everything that seemed beyond his reach. How could he dream of freedom when his family slept in a hog pen? How could he imagine adventure when leaving the homestead meant abandoning his mother and sister to face his father's anger alone? "What are you thinking about, Samuel?" Clara asked, settling beside him on the creek bank where the morning sun filtered through the willow branches and created dancing patterns on the water's surface. She'd been watching him for several minutes, noting the way he turned the wooden horse over and over in his hands, the serious expression that made him look older than his years. "Grandpa used to say that horses could take you anywhere you wanted to go," Samuel said quietly, not looking up from the toy. "But we don't have any horses, and even if we did, Papa wouldn't let us go anywhere." Clara's heart ached at the resignation in her son's voice. Samuel had inherited her father's thoughtful nature and his quiet wisdom, but he'd also inherited the burden of seeing their situation clearly. Unlike Mary, who still possessed the protective innocence of childhood, Samuel understood that their circumstances were neither normal nor temporary. "Your grandfather was a wise man," Clara said carefully, "but sometimes he spoke about journeys that weren't just about moving from one place to another. Sometimes the most important journey is the one that happens inside your heart." Samuel looked at her then, his pale blue eyes so like Ezra's, yet somehow entirely different in their expression, searching her face for meaning. "What kind of journey?" Clara considered her words, knowing that whatever she said would shape how her son understood not just their current situation, but his own possibilities for the future. She wanted to give him hope without creating expectations that might lead to disappointment. She wanted to teach him resilience without accepting resignation. "The journey from being afraid to being brave," she said finally. "From feeling powerless to understanding your own strength. From believing that things can never change to knowing that change is always possible, even when it doesn't come in the way you expected." Samuel nodded slowly, as if filing away this information for future consideration. "Is that why the nice man came back? To help us take that kind of journey?" The question caught Clara off guard with its perceptiveness. Samuel had noticed more than she'd realized during Luke's visits, had understood that the Cowboys' interest went beyond simple business arrangements. Her son was learning to read the subtleties of adult interaction, developing skills that might protect him in the years to come. "I don't know," Clara said honestly. "Mr. Callahan seems like a good man, but we can't count on other people to solve our problems for us. Sometimes we have to find our own way." "But Grandpa also said that good people help each other," Samuel pointed out with the relentless logic of childhood. "He said that's what makes a community strong, when everyone looks out for everyone else." Clara smiled despite herself, remembering her father's passionate belief in the interdependence of neighbors. He'd been the kind of man who organized barn raisings and harvest help, who never let a family go hungry if he had food to share. His vision of community had been built on mutual aid and reciprocal kindness, values that seemed increasingly rare in the harsh reality of their current circumstances. "You're right," Clara said. "Your grandfather did believe that. But he also believed that we have to be willing to help ourselves before we can accept help from others. We have to prove that we're worth the investment." Samuel turned the wooden horse in his hands again, studying its carved features as if they might reveal some secret wisdom. "How do we prove that?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Clara wasn't sure she was ready to explore. How did a woman trapped in an abusive marriage prove her worth? How did children sleeping in a hog pen demonstrate their potential? The conventional answer-shard work, moral character, perseverance seemed inadequate when applied to circumstances that defied conventional solutions. "We prove it by never giving up on ourselves," Clara said finally, the words coming from a part of her that she'd thought had been silenced by years of systematic diminishment. "We prove it by remembering who we are underneath all the things that have happened to us. We prove it by protecting what matters most, even when everything else falls apart." Samuel nodded gravely, as if accepting a sacred trust. "And what matters most?" "Each other," Clara said without hesitation. "Love, kindness, the part of us that stays gentle, even when the world is hard. Those things can't be taken away unless we let them go." The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their conversation, and Clara felt her stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. Visitors still meant complications, still carried the potential for making their precarious situation worse. But as the rider came into view through the trees, Clara recognized Luke Callahan's distinctive silhouette and felt something between relief and apprehension settle in her chest. Mr. Callahan's back, Samuel observed, his grip tightening on the wooden horse. Should we go tell Papa? Clara watched Luke approach, noting the way he sat his horse with casual confidence, the unhurried pace that suggested this was a planned visit rather than an emergency. He'd come alone again, she noticed, which meant this was personal rather than strictly business. In a moment, Clara said, buying herself time to compose her thoughts. Let me see what he wants first. Luke dismounted near the creek bank, tying his horse to a sturdy willow branch before approaching with the respectful distance of a man who understood that his presence might be both welcome and dangerous. He touched his hat brim in greeting, his eyes taking in Clara and Samuel with the same careful attention he'd shown during his previous visits. Mrs. Whitfield, Samuel, he said, his voice carrying the warm courtesy that had made such an impression during their first meeting. I hope I'm not intruding. I was checking on my cattle in the back 40 and thought I'd stop by to see how you folks are getting along. It was a reasonable excuse, the kind of neighborly gesture that couldn't be criticized, even by the most suspicious husband. But Clara could see the deeper purpose in Luke's eyes, the genuine concern that had brought him back, despite the obvious complications his presence created. We're managing fine, Mr. Callahan, Clara said carefully, glancing toward the house to see if Ezra had noticed their visitor. Though I'm sure Ezra would want to know you're here. Of course, Luke agreed, though he made no immediate move toward the house. Instead, his attention focused on Samuel, who was watching the exchange with the intense concentration of a child trying to understand adult motivations. That's a fine horse you've got there, son, Luke observed, nodding toward the wooden toy in Samuel's hands. Looks like quality carving. Samuel looked up at Clara for permission before responding, a habit that broke Luke's heart, even as it demonstrated the boy's wisdom in navigating his father's unpredictable moods. At Clara's encouraging nod, Samuel held up the wooden horse for Luke's inspection. My grandpa made it for me, Samuel said with quiet pride. He said horses were symbols of freedom. Luke knelt down to Samuel's level, examining the carving with the serious attention it deserved. Your grandfather was a craftsman, he said admiringly, and a wise man. Horses have always been partners to humans. They carry us to places we couldn't reach on our own, but they also teach us about trust and mutual respect. Do you have horses, Mr. Callahan? Samuel asked, his reserve melting under the warmth of Luke's attention. I do indeed, Luke replied. More than I can count, though I'd say they own me more than I own them. Each one has its own personality, its own way of looking at the world. Some are gentle as lambs, some are spirited as wildfire, but they all have one thing in common. They know the difference between a person who means them harm and a person who wishes them well. Clara watched this exchange with growing amazement. Luke was speaking to Samuel as he would to any intelligent person, neither talking down to him nor overwhelming him with complexity. He was offering the kind of respect and attention that could shape a boy's understanding of his own worth, the kind of interaction that could plant seeds of confidence that would grow throughout a lifetime. I've never ridden a horse, Samuel admitted, his voice carrying a note of wistfulness that made Clara's chest tighten with shared longing. Well, that's something that could be remedied, Luke said thoughtfully, with your mother's permission, of course, and when circumstances allow for it. The casual offer hung in the air like a promise, and Clara saw Samuel's eyes light up with the kind of hope she'd been trying to protect him from. But before she could formulate a response that would manage expectations without crushing dreams, Ezra's voice cut across the morning air. Callahan, what brings you back so soon? Luke rose smoothly to his feet, his expression shifting to the neutral courtesy appropriate for business dealings. Just checking on the cattle, Mr. Whitfield. Wanted to make sure they weren't causing any problems with your property. Ezra approached with the slightly unsteady gait that suggested he'd started drinking earlier than usual, his eyes taking in the scene with obvious suspicion. Clara could see him cataloguing details: Luke's position near the creek, his interaction with Samuel, The relaxed way, Clara was sitting rather than working, and building them into evidence of some unspecified transgression. Problems? Ezra's laugh carried an edge that made Clara tense with anticipation. The only problems I'm seeing are strangers spending too much time socializing with my family instead of tending to business. Luke's expression didn't change, but Clara caught a slight tightening around his eyes that suggested Ezra's rudeness hadn't gone unnoticed. "I understand your concern," Luke said evenly. "I was just complimenting young Samuel on his carved horse. It's a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, made by my wife's father." Ezra said dismissively, "Man who never understood that pretty things don't pay bills, always filling people's heads with romantic notions instead of practical sense." Clara flinched at the casual cruelty of dismissing her father's memory, but she also noticed the way Luke's jaw tightened at Ezra's words. Luke was learning about the family dynamics, she realized, gathering information that might prove useful in ways she couldn't yet imagine. "Craftsmanship is always valuable," Luke said mildly. "Skills like that often run in families." The comment seemed neutral enough, but Clara caught the implied compliment to her own abilities and to Samuel's potential. Luke was acknowledging their worth in front of Ezra, a dangerous kindness that could have consequences long after he rode away. "Samuel, take your sister and go help with the chickens," Ezra ordered, his tone brooking no argument. "Your mother and I need to talk business with Mr. Callahan." Samuel looked reluctantly toward the house where Mary was playing with corn-husk dolls on the porch, clearly unwilling to leave his mother alone with two men whose relationship seemed increasingly strained. But he was too young to effectively intervene and too smart to directly disobey his father's orders. "Go on, sweetheart," Clara said gently, recognizing Samuel's dilemma. "I'll be along shortly." As Samuel walked toward the house, clutching his wooden horse like a talisman, Clara found herself alone with the two men who represented the opposing forces in her life. Ezra embodied her past and presented the cage of her circumstances, the weight of obligations that seemed to grow heavier with each passing year. Luke represented possibility, the tantalizing suggestion that different choices might lead to different outcomes. "I trust the cattle are settling in well," Clara said, trying to direct the conversation towards safe territory. "Very well indeed," Luke replied, his attention focused on her face with an intensity that made her nervous. "The grass is excellent, and the water access is everything you promised. You know this land better than anyone I've consulted with." The compliment was sincere, but Clara could see how it affected Ezra, whose sense of ownership and authority was built on being the recognized expert on his own property. Every acknowledgement of Clara's knowledge was an implicit criticism of his leadership, every sign of her competence a reminder of his own failures. "Clara grew up here," Ezra said, his voice tight with suppressed anger. "Knows every rock and tree like they were family. Course, knowing land and managing it profitably are two different things entirely." "Indeed they are," Luke agreed, though his tone suggested he might have opinions about which skill was more valuable. "Good management requires understanding what you're working with, and that kind of understanding usually comes from long observation and deep care." Clara recognized the diplomatic way Luke was defending her knowledge while avoiding direct criticism of Ezra's methods. But she also knew that diplomacy would only protect her while Luke was present. Once he left, Ezra's wounded pride would need an outlet, and she and the children would bear the brunt of his humiliation. "Was there something specific you needed to discuss about the grazing arrangement?" Clara asked, hoping to conclude the conversation before it escalated into open conflict. Luke's eyes met hers, and she saw understanding flicker their recognition that his presence was creating complications for her, acknowledgement that his good intentions might have unintended consequences. "Actually, there was," he said. "I've been thinking about expanding the arrangement, possibly leasing additional acreage if it's available." The suggestion clearly caught Ezra's interest, and Clara saw his posture shift from defensive to calculating as he considered the potential for additional income. Money was always Ezra's weakness, the one consideration that could override his pride and suspicion. "What kind of expansion?" Ezra asked, his voice losing some of its hostile edge. "Well, That would depend on what you have available and what terms might be agreeable, Luke said. Perhaps we could walk the property again, assess the options more thoroughly. As the two men began discussing business details, Clara found herself studying Luke with new understanding. He was creating legitimate reasons to return, establishing a pattern of visits that couldn't be questioned or forbidden. Whether this was calculated strategy or simple kindness, Clara couldn't tell, but she recognized it as a lifeline that might prove crucial in the days to come. The wooden horse Samuel had left behind lay forgotten in the grass beside the creek, its carved features catching the morning sunlight. Clara picked it up carefully, feeling the smooth wood warm under her fingers, remembering her father's hands shaping it with patience and love. The horse had been meant to inspire dreams of freedom, but perhaps it could serve an even more important purpose, a reminder that freedom sometimes came not in a single dramatic escape, but in the accumulation of small choices, small acts of courage, small moments when dignity was preserved against all odds. As Luke and Ezra walked toward the house to continue their negotiations, Clara clutched the wooden horse and allowed herself to hope that change might come not as rescue from outside, but as strength discovered within strength that could carry her and her children to safety on their own terms, in their own time, powered by their own courage and the kindness of those brave enough to offer help when it was needed most. The whiskey bottle had become Ezra's constant companion, an amber-colored confessor that listened to his grievances without judgment and offered liquid comfort without demanding change in return. It sat now on the kitchen table, half empty in the afternoon, light that streamed through windows. Clara had long since given up trying to keep clean. Ezra's relationship with the bottle had evolved from occasional refuge to daily necessity, a progression that Clara had watched with growing dread as his drinking moved from numbing his failures to fueling his rage. Since Luke's latest visit 3 days ago, the bottle had been Ezra's primary counsel, whispering poison in his ear about threats to his authority and conspiracies to undermine his position as head of his household. The additional income from the expanded grazing lease should have improved his mood, but instead it seemed to have deepened his resentment. Every dollar Luke paid was proof that Clara's knowledge had value, that her contributions to the negotiation had been essential, that his wife possessed expertise he lacked. Clara could hear him muttering to himself as she worked in the vegetable garden, trying to salvage what she could from the weeds and neglect that had choked out most of their food crops. His voice carried through the open kitchen window, a running commentary of grievances and suspicions that grew more elaborate with each sip from the bottle. Thinks he's so clever, coming around here with his fancy horse and his polite manners, making me look like some kind of fool who doesn't know his own business. But I see what he's doing. Oh yes, I see exactly what he's doing. The monologue had been going on for hours, cycling through the same themes with variations that grew more paranoid and violent with each repetition. Clara had learned to monitor these sessions carefully, listening for the particular shift in tone that signaled when Ezra's anger was approaching the point where it would seek physical expression. Mary and Samuel sat beside her in the garden, their small hands carefully pulling weeds from around the struggling tomato plants that represented their best hope for fresh food in the coming months. Clara had taught them to work quietly during their father's drinking sessions, to avoid drawing attention that might redirect his anger toward them. "Mama," Mary whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of Ezra's increasingly agitated muttering. "Why is Papa so angry all the time?" It was a question Clara had been dreading, though she'd known it would come eventually. Mary was 7 now, old enough to recognize patterns, even if she couldn't understand their causes. The innocent directness of childhood cut through pretense and demanded honest answers that Clara wasn't sure she could provide. Sometimes when people are hurt, they don't know how to make the hurt stop. Clara said carefully, her hands never pausing in their work among the plants. So they try to make other people feel as bad as they do, thinking that might help them feel better. But it doesn't work, does it? Samuel observed with the uncomfortable wisdom that had become his trademark. Making other people hurt just makes everyone hurt. Clara's heart ached at her son's precocious understanding of human nature. Samuel was learning lessons about pain and power that no 8-year-old should have to master, developing insights that spoke to his intelligence but also to the harsh realities that shaped his daily experience. "No, sweetheart, it doesn't work," Clara agreed. "But sometimes people keep trying the same things over and over, even when they know they don't work, because they don't know what else to do." From the kitchen came the sound of chair legs scraping against wooden floors, followed by the heavy footsteps that meant Ezra was moving around the house. Clara tensed automatically, her body preparing for whatever confrontation might be building. She'd developed an acute sensitivity to the rhythms of his drinking, the way his physical movements changed as alcohol transformed brooding resentment into active hostility. "Clara!" His voice carried the particular edge that meant he'd found a new focus for his anger. "Get in here now." Clara's hands stilled in the soil, and she felt the familiar twist of fear in her stomach. There was no refusing such a summons, no safe way to delay or deflect when Ezra's voice carried that tone of command. She looked at the twins, who had gone very still beside her, their young faces reflecting the same tension that coiled in her own muscles. "Stay here," she told them quietly. "Keep working in the garden, and don't come inside unless I call for you." The walk to the kitchen felt like a journey across a vast distance, though it was only a few yards from the garden to the back door. Clara wiped her hands on her apron, smoothed her hair, and tried to compose her expression into the neutral mask that offered the least provocation to Ezra's volatile moods. She found him standing beside the table, the whiskey bottle clutched in one hand, while the other held a piece of paper that Clara didn't immediately recognize. His face was flushed with alcohol and anger, his eyes bright with the particular gleam that meant he'd discovered something he could use as ammunition in whatever battle he was fighting inside his own mind. "What's this?" he asked, waving the paper in her direction. Clara's heart stopped as she recognized Luke's business card, the one she'd hidden in her sewing basket beneath the loose floorboard in the hog pen. Somehow, Ezra had found it, had violated her small sanctuary, and discovered the one tangible proof of her secret hopes. Clara began, but Ezra cut her off with a gesture that made the whiskey slosh dangerously in the bottle. "Don't lie to me," he snarled. "I know what this is. Question is, why are you hiding it? Why is my wife keeping another man's calling card like some kind of love letter?" The accusation hit Clara like a physical blow, not because it was accurate, but because it revealed how completely Ezra had misunderstood the nature of Luke's offer. The business card represented hope for help in an emergency, a lifeline offered by someone who recognized their suffering. But in Ezra's alcohol-soaked imagination, it had become evidence of infidelity, proof of betrayal that existed only in his own paranoid fantasies. "It's not what you think," Clara said, knowing, even as she spoke, that explanations would be useless. When Ezra was drinking this heavily, reality became whatever served his need to feel wronged and justified in his anger. "Isn't it?" Ezra's laugh was ugly, devoid of any humor. "Then explain to me why you felt the need to hide it. Explain to me why you kept another man's information secret from your husband." Clara searched for words that might diffuse the situation, explanations that might penetrate the wall of suspicion and resentment that alcohol had built around Ezra's reasoning. But she could see from his expression that he'd already constructed a complete narrative in his mind, a story of betrayal and deception that cast him as the wronged husband and her as the faithless wife. "He said to contact him if we needed help," Clara said carefully. "It seemed like the kind of thing it might be good to know in case of emergency." "Emergency?" Ezra's voice dripped with contempt. "What kind of emergency would require you to contact another man without your husband's knowledge? What kind of emergency would make you turn to a stranger instead of relying on your own family?" The questions revealed the depth of Ezra's self-deception, his ability to reframe even the most obvious truths in ways that supported his preferred narrative. He was the one who'd banished them to sleep among animals, who'd threatened them with violence, who'd created the very emergency conditions that made Luke's offer of help necessary. But in his mind, Clara's acceptance of that help was betrayal rather than survival. "There is no emergency," Clara said, though the words felt like lies even as she spoke them. "I just thought—" "You thought what? That you could make plans behind my back? That you could build relationships with other men without your husband knowing about it?" Ezra stepped closer, and Clara caught the full force of whiskey fumes, mixed with the sour smell of unwashed clothes and accumulated resentment. His free hand moved to his belt, not quite threatening, but close enough to make Clara's breath catch in her throat. "You've been different since he started coming around," Ezra continued, his voice dropping to the dangerous whisper that always preceded his worst behavior. "Walking taller, speaking up more, acting like you've got options you didn't have before. But you don't have options, Clara. You have obligations. You have responsibilities. You have a husband who's sacrificed everything to keep this family together." The distortion of reality was so complete that Clara felt dizzy trying to follow Ezra's logic. He'd sacrificed everything? He was keeping the family together? The man who forced his wife and children to sleep in a hog pen saw himself as a martyr, a victim of circumstances beyond his control, rather than the architect of his family's suffering. "I know my responsibilities," Clara said quietly, trying to project the complete submission that sometimes satisfied Ezra's need for dominance. "Do you?" Ezra's smile was cold and calculating. "Because it seems to me like you need a reminder. It seems to me like you've forgotten who makes the decisions in this household, who provides for this family, who has the right to determine what's acceptable and what isn't." Clara said nothing, recognizing that any response would only provide additional fuel for Ezra's anger. He was working himself up to something, building a case for whatever punishment he'd already decided to inflict. The specific crime mattered less than his need to reassert control, to remind her that any hope of change existed only at his pleasure. "You want to know what's going to happen?" Ezra asked, though his tone made it clear the question was rhetorical. "You're going to tell Callahan that his services aren't needed anymore. You're going to make it clear that this family doesn't require assistance from outsiders, and if I ever find evidence that you've been making plans behind my back again, the consequences will be severe." The threat hung in the air between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Clara understood that Ezra was drawing new boundaries, establishing new rules that would make any future contact with Luke dangerous not just for her, but for the twins as well. She was being forced to choose between the possibility of help and the immediate safety of her children. "I understand," Clara said, the words scraping her throat like broken glass. "I hope you do," Ezra replied, settling back into his chair with the satisfaction of a man who believed he'd solved a problem through decisive action. "Because this family's reputation depends on your behavior, and I won't have that reputation damaged by a wife who doesn't understand her proper place." As Clara turned to leave the kitchen, she caught sight of the twins through the window, still working quietly in the garden, with the careful concentration of children who'd learned to make themselves invisible during their father's rages. They looked so small and vulnerable in the afternoon sunlight, so dependent on her protection and guidance. Whatever dreams of rescue she'd been harboring, whatever hopes Luke's kindness had awakened, she couldn't pursue them if it meant putting Mary and Samuel at greater risk. The whiskey bottle caught the light as Ezra lifted it to his lips, its amber contents promising him another few hours of liquid courage and righteous indignation. Clara knew that his anger wouldn't end with her submission, that the alcohol would continue to feed his resentment and paranoia until he found new targets for his frustration. But for now, in this moment, she had bought them safety through surrender. Walking back to the garden, Clara felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. The hope that Luke's kindness had planted was being deliberately crushed, and with it a part of herself that she'd thought might be capable of fighting for something better. The business card was gone, confiscated and probably destroyed, along with the tangible proof that someone in the world believed she deserved help. But as she knelt beside Mary and Samuel in the dirt, continuing the work of trying to coax life from reluctant soil, Clara realized that hope didn't require physical talismans to survive. Luke's recognition of her worth, his acknowledgement of her children's value, His simple insistence that every person deserved dignity, these things lived in her memory now, beyond Ezra's ability to confiscate or destroy them. The whiskey bottle would eventually empty, as it always did. Ezra's anger would eventually exhaust itself, as it always did. And when that happened, Clara would still be here, still protecting her children, still holding on to the knowledge that somewhere in the world, goodness existed and help was possible for those brave enough to seek it. The question now was whether she could find the courage to be one of those people, whether she could transform hope from a passive wish into active choice, whether she could prove worthy of the better life that Luke's kindness had shown her was possible. Clara's mother's Bible lay open in her lap, its leather binding worn soft by decades of faithful hands, and its pages marked with pressed wildflowers that had once brightened the margins with their delicate beauty. Now, sitting in the pre-dawn darkness of the hog pen while Mary and Samuel slept beside her, Clara traced her finger along the familiar verses that had sustained her mother through her own trials and had been passed down as both heritage and hope. The Bible contained more than scripture. Tucked between its pages were the records of 3 generations of her family. Birth certificates written in her grandmother's careful script, marriage announcements pressed between tissue paper, even a few photographs that had survived floods and fires and the simple passage of time. But most precious of all was the family tree her mother had maintained, documenting births and deaths, marriages and migrations, creating a testament to continuity that stretched back to the earliest settlers in Texas. Looking at those records now, Clara realized she was part of a legacy of strong women who had faced impossible circumstances and found ways to survive. Her great-grandmother had crossed the plains in a covered wagon, burying children along the trail, but pressing forward toward the promise of new land. Her grandmother had held the homestead together during the Civil War, while her husband fought with Hood's Texas Brigade, raising crops and children with equal determination. Her own mother had weathered droughts and floods, market crashes and personal losses, always maintaining that faith and family were the only wealth that truly mattered. "Help me understand your will, Lord," Clara whispered into the darkness, her voice barely audible above the soft breathing of her sleeping children. "Help me find the strength that you gave, the women who came before me." The prayer felt different tonight, carrying weight and urgency that reflected the new clarity that had been building in Clara's mind since Ezra's discovery of Luke's business card. For too long she'd been passive in her suffering, accepting each degradation as inevitable, each cruelty as simply the price of keeping her family together. But seeing her circumstances through Luke's eyes, witnessing his shock at their living conditions, his insistence that they deserved better, had awakened something in her that felt both familiar and foreign. It was familiar because it echoed the voice of her father, who had taught her that every person was worthy of respect and dignity. It was foreign because she'd spent so many years suppressing that voice, learning to make herself small and silent to avoid triggering Ezra's wrath. Now, in the quiet hours before dawn, she found herself remembering who she'd been before fear became her primary motivation. The pressed flowers in the Bible's margins told their own story of resilience. Texas bluebonnets from the spring when Mary was born, their petals still holding traces of the blue that had covered the meadows that year. Wild roses from the day Samuel took his first steps, their thorns carefully removed, but their beauty preserved. Indian paintbrush from the last good harvest they'd had, when Clara had still believed that hard work and prayer could overcome any obstacle. Each flower represented a moment when Clara had chosen hope over despair, beauty over resignation. They were small acts of rebellion against the harshness of life, tiny assertions that joy could exist even in difficult circumstances. Looking at them now, Clara wondered when she'd stopped picking flowers, when she'd stopped finding beauty worth preserving. The sound of movement from the house made Clara tense automatically, her body responding to the possibility of Ezra's approach with the conditioned fear of someone who'd learned that any disturbance could signal danger. But the footsteps were unsteady, suggesting he was moving toward the outhouse rather than seeking confrontation, and after a few minutes the house settled back into silence. Clara returned her attention to the Bible, finding comfort in the familiar weight of its pages and the memories they contained. Her mother had read to her from this book every night, stories of courage and redemption that had shaped Clara's understanding of right and wrong. Stories of Esther, who risked her life to save her people. Of Ruth, who chose loyalty over security. Of the woman at the well, who found dignity in Christ's recognition of her worth despite her circumstances. "What would you do, Mama?" Clara whispered, addressing the memory of the woman who had been her first teacher in faith and resilience. "How would you find the courage to change what seems unchangeable?" The answer came not in words, but in memory, the recollection of her mother's hands, always busy with some task that served the family's needs. Mending clothes late into the night, preserving food for lean times, tending sick children with patient determination. Her mother had found power in service, strength in small acts of love that accumulated over time into something larger than themselves. But Clara's mother had also been married to a good man, a partner who valued her contributions and protected her dignity. Clara's circumstances were different, requiring different choices and different kinds of courage. The question was whether she possessed the strength to make those choices when the time came. The first hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, painting the clouds with delicate shades of pink and gold that reminded Clara of the pressed roses in her Bible's pages. Soon the twins would wake, and the day's routines would begin the careful navigation of Ezra's moods, the constant vigilance required to keep her children safe, the slow erosion of hope that came from living each day in survival mode. But this morning felt different, charged with possibility that Clara couldn't quite name but could feel in her bones. Perhaps it was the effect of spending time with the family records, being reminded of her connection to women who'd faced greater challenges and survived them. Perhaps it was the memory of Luke's kindness, the knowledge that somewhere in the world, people still believed in justice and dignity. Or perhaps it was simply the natural resilience of the human spirit, reasserting itself after being suppressed for too long. "Mama!" Mary's sleepy voice interrupted Clara's contemplation. "Is it morning yet?" Clara smiled at her daughter's question, recognizing the hope it contained. Every morning represented a new beginning, another chance for things to be different, better, brighter than they'd been the day before. It was a child's wisdom, the ability to greet each dawn with renewed optimism, despite yesterday's disappointments. "Almost, sweetheart," Clara said softly, closing the Bible carefully and setting it aside. "The sun's just starting to wake up, same as you." Mary sat up slowly, her dark hair tousled from sleep and her eyes still heavy with dreams. At 7, she was beginning to lose some of childhood's protective innocence, but she still possessed the resilience to find joy in simple things, the warmth of sunlight on her face, the discovery of a wildflower growing through a crack in the fence, the sound of her mother's voice reading stories before bed. "Can we pick flowers today?" Mary asked, the question catching Clara by surprise with its directness. "There are lots of pretty ones growing by the creek, and they smell nice." Clara felt her heart clench at the request, recognizing it as a small act of faith in the possibility of beauty existing alongside hardship. Mary was asking for permission to choose joy, to assert that their circumstances didn't have to define the entirety of their experience. "Yes," Clara said, the word carrying more weight than Mary could understand. "Yes, we can pick flowers today." As Samuel stirred beside them, beginning his own gradual transition from sleep to wakefulness, Clara made a silent promise to herself and to the memory of the strong women whose blood ran in her veins. She would not allow fear to destroy every possibility of joy in her children's lives. She would find ways to preserve beauty, to maintain dignity, to keep hope alive even in the most difficult circumstances. The Bible contained pressed flowers, but it also contained stories of deliverance, accounts of people who found the courage to seek better lives when the old ones became unbearable. Clara had been reading those stories for years without truly hearing their message, focusing on the comfort they provided rather than the action they demanded. But this morning, watching her children wake to another day of circumstances that should have been unthinkable, Clara felt something shift in her understanding. Faith wasn't passive acceptance of suffering, it was active trust that God could work through human courage to create change. The women in her family hadn't survived by submitting to injustice, but by finding ways to resist it, to protect what mattered most, to build better lives for their children. The pressed flowers in the Bible would always be beautiful, but they were also reminders that some things, beauty, dignity, hope, were worth preserving, even when everything else seemed lost. And if they were worth preserving, perhaps they were also worth fighting for, worth the risk that came with choosing courage over safety, truth over peace, action over endurance. As the twins fully awakened and began the familiar routine of another day, Clara held on to this new understanding like a secret flame. She would pick flowers with Mary today, press them in the Bible's pages, as her mother and grandmother had done. But she would also begin to plant seeds of a different kind, the kind that grew into courage, the kind that might eventually bloom into freedom. The morning light grew stronger, burning away the last shadows of night and illuminating the world with the promise that change was always possible for those brave enough to embrace it. Clara gathered her children close, breathing in their sweet scent and feeling their warm trust, and knew that whatever came next, she would face it with the strength of generations behind her and the love of her children before her. The Bible lay beside them in the straw, its pressed flowers holding their beauty and its pages holding their promises, waiting for Clara to choose between the safety of endurance and the danger of hope. For the first time in years, the choice felt possible rather than predetermined, and that possibility was perhaps the most precious flower of all. The original land deed lay spread across Luke Callahan's kitchen table like a map to buried treasure, its yellowed parchment and faded ink telling a story that had been deliberately obscured for more than 2 decades. Luke's lawyer, Thomas Hartwell, adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles as he examined the document that had taken 3 weeks of careful investigation to unearth from the courthouse records in Austin. What they'd discovered would change everything Clara thought she knew about her circumstances and her rights. "There's no question about it, Luke," Thomas said, his finger tracing the careful copperplate script that documented the original land grant. This property was deeded to Clara May Patterson, now Whitfield, upon her father's death in 1882. According to Texas law, her marriage to Ezra doesn't automatically transfer ownership to him unless she explicitly signed a quitclaim deed, which there's no record of in any courthouse I've searched. Luke stared at the document, feeling a mixture of vindication and anger building in his chest. He'd suspected something was amiss when Ezra had been so eager to negotiate grazing rights for land he claimed to own, but seemed to know so little about. Clara's encyclopedic knowledge of every creek, pasture, and seasonal pattern had suggested a deeper connection than that of a mere resident. Now the truth was laid bare in legal language that couldn't be disputed. "So Clara owns the land," Luke said, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "She's been sleeping in a hog pen on her own property, while her husband treats her like a burden he's graciously allowed to remain." "It's worse than that," Thomas continued, pulling out a second document that Luke hadn't seen before. "I found this filed 3 months after her father's death, a forged quitclaim deed, purporting to transfer ownership to Ezra Whitfield. The signatures don't match any verified examples of Clara's handwriting from before her marriage, and the notarization is suspicious. I believe Ezra forged this document to establish legal claim to property that was never rightfully his." The implications hit Luke like a physical blow. Not only had Ezra been abusing his wife and children, but he'd been doing it on land that belonged to Clara herself. The systematic campaign to make her feel worthless, dependent, and trapped had been built on a foundation of fraud that could be exposed and challenged in court. "What does this mean for Clara?" Luke asked, though his legal knowledge was sufficient to understand the basics. "What are her options?" Thomas leaned back in his chair, organizing his thoughts before responding. If we can prove the forgery, and I believe we can, Clara could file suit to reclaim full legal ownership of the property. She could evict Ezra, sell the land, or simply assert her rights as the rightful owner. More importantly, she has grounds for criminal charges against her husband for fraud, forgery, and possibly theft. Luke felt a surge of hope mixed with concern for the practical realities Clara would face. Legal vindication was one thing, but translating that vindication into actual safety for her and the children was quite another. Ezra's reaction to having his authority challenged had already been violent, though. Much worse might it become if he faced the prospect of losing everything he'd built his identity around. The challenge, Thomas continued, anticipating Luke's concerns, will be getting Clara to safety while the legal process unfolds. Men like Ezra don't surrender power willingly, especially when they're facing the humiliation of being exposed as frauds. If he realizes what we've discovered, he might become extremely dangerous. Luke nodded grimly, his mind already working through the logistics of protection and legal strategy. He'd been planning to help Clara and the children gradually, finding ways to improve their circumstances without triggering a catastrophic confrontation. But this discovery changed everything, offering the possibility of complete liberation at the cost of immediate and significant risk. "I need to tell her," Luke said, though he dreaded the conversation that would follow. "She has a right to know the truth about her situation." "Agreed," Thomas said, carefully folding the documents and placing them in his leather portfolio. "But Luke, you need to understand that knowledge like this can be dangerous. Once Clara knows she has legal rights, she'll have to decide whether to assert them. And once she makes that decision, there's no going back to the way things were." Luke understood the warning, but he also understood that some truths were too important to withhold. Clara had been living a lie for 20 years, accepting degradation and abuse because she believed she had no alternatives. Learning that she was actually the rightful owner of the property might give her the strength to fight for the life she and her children deserved. The ride to the Whitfield homestead felt longer than usual, weighted with the knowledge Luke carried and the uncertainty of how Clara would receive it. He'd deliberately chosen to visit during the afternoon hours when Ezra was most likely to be drinking himself into his daily stupor, creating a window of opportunity for private conversation. As he approached the property, Luke's trained eye took in details that now carried new significance. The house that Clara's father had built with his own hands, the barn that had sheltered generations of livestock, the fences that marked boundaries drawn by Clara's grandfather when this part of Texas was still frontier territorial. Of it belonged to the woman who was currently forbidden to sleep under her own roof. He found Clara hanging laundry behind the house, her movements efficient, despite the obvious fatigue that seemed to cling to her like a second skin. The twins played nearby, constructing elaborate cities from dried corn cobs and discarded pieces of wood, their imagination transforming refuse into treasure with the resilience that Luke had come to admire in all three members of this remarkable family. "Mrs. Whitfield," Luke called softly, not wanting to startle her or alert Ezra to his presence, "might I have a word with you?" Clara looked up from the wet sheets she was hanging on the line, her expression cycling through surprise, wariness, and something that might have been hope before settling into the careful neutrality she'd learned to project when circumstances were uncertain. "Mr. Callahan," she said, glancing toward the house where Ezra's snores were audible through the open windows. "Ezra's sleeping. If you need to discuss business—" "Actually, it's you I need to speak with," Luke said gently, "about business that concerns you directly." Clara's hand stilled on the clothesline, and Luke saw understanding flicker in her eyes. She knew that any business concerning her specifically was likely to be complicated, potentially dangerous, and certainly something that would require careful consideration. "Mary, Samuel," Clara called to the twins, her voice carrying the particular tone that meant adult conversations were about to take place. "Why don't you take your game down to the creek? Stay where I can see you, but give us some space to talk." The children obeyed without question, gathering their corncob buildings and relocating to a spot near the willow trees where they could continue their play while remaining within their mother's sight. Luke noticed how quickly they responded to Clara's directions, how smoothly they adapted to changing circumstances skills that spoke to the unpredictable nature of their daily lives. "What is it, Mr. Callahan?" Clara asked once the children were safely out of earshot. "Has something happened?" Luke pulled the folded documents from his jacket pocket, feeling their weight as both promise and burden. "Clara, Mrs. Whitfield, what I'm about to tell you may come as a shock. I need you to sit down." Clara's eyes widened at the formality of his tone, but she remained standing, her body tense with the anticipation of bad news. In her experience, serious conversations with men rarely brought good tidings. "I had my lawyer research the ownership of this property," Luke began, choosing his words carefully. "What we found changes everything about your situation." He handed her the original deed, watching her face as she recognized her father's signature and her own name written in the careful script that established legal ownership. Clara's hands trembled as she read the document, her eyes moving across the lines that designated her as sole heir to the property her family had owned for 2 generations. "I don't understand," Clara whispered, though Luke could see that she was beginning to understand all too well. This says the land belongs to me." "Yes," Luke confirmed gently. "It does. Your father left everything to you when he died. By law, your marriage to Ezra doesn't change that unless you voluntarily transferred ownership to him." Clara's face went pale as the implications began to sink in. "But the bank papers, the mortgage documents, they all have Ezra's name on them. He's the one who deals with the creditors, who makes the decisions about planting and selling." Luke handed her the second document, the forged quitclaim deed that Thomas had identified as fraudulent. "This is why. Someone created false paperwork to make it appear that you'd signed over your rights. But the signatures don't match, and the notarization is invalid. You never gave up ownership of this land." Clara stared at the forged document, her finger tracing the signature that bore her name but not her handwriting. Luke watched her process the magnitude of the deception, the systematic way her identity and rights had been erased to serve Ezra's purposes. "He forged my signature," Clara said, her voice carrying a note of disbelief, even though the evidence was undeniable. "He stole my inheritance and made me believe I was dependent on his charity." "Yes," Luke said simply, though the word carried the weight of 20 years of lies and manipulation. Clara sank onto the wooden stump that served as an informal seat near the clothesline, the documents clutched in her hands like proof of a miracle she'd never dared to imagine. "All these years," she murmured, "all these years he's been telling me how lucky I am that he keeps me, how grateful I should be for his protection. And this whole time, it was my land, my house, my inheritance from Papa." Luke knelt beside her, his voice gentle but urgent. "Clara, this changes everything. You have legal rights. You can reclaim your property, assert your ownership, make decisions about your own life and your children's future." Clara looked up at him, and Luke saw something he'd never seen in her eyes before, not just hope, but a kind of fierce awakening, as if she was remembering who she'd been before fear and manipulation had convinced her she was powerless. "What would that mean?" she asked. "If I tried to reclaim the land, what would happen?" Luke had been dreading this question because the answer was both liberating and terrifying. "It would mean asserting your rights in court, proving the forgery, and establishing your legal ownership. It would mean you could make Ezra leave if you chose to. But Clara, it would also mean confronting him with the truth, and men like Ezra don't surrender power willingly." Clara nodded slowly, understanding flowing through her expression like sunrise breaking through clouds. He would be furious. More than furious, would see it as the ultimate betrayal. "Yes," Luke agreed. "But Clara, you need to understand you're not betraying him. He betrayed you. He stole from you. He's built his entire sense of authority on a foundation of fraud and deception." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that would reshape everything Clara thought she knew about her marriage, her circumstances, and her options. Luke watched her absorb this new reality, saw her mind working through the possibilities and consequences that came with knowledge she couldn't unknow. "The twins," Clara said suddenly, her protective instincts reasserting themselves. "If Ezra becomes violent, if he feels cornered—" "I know," Luke said, his voice steady and reassuring. "That's why we need to plan carefully. Knowledge is power, but it's also responsibility. You have choices now that you didn't have before, but those choices come with risks that we need to manage intelligently." Clara stood slowly, the document still clutched in her hands as she looked around the property with new eyes. This wasn't just the place where she'd suffered, it was her birthright, her children's inheritance, the foundation of a life she could build on her own terms if she found the courage to claim it. "I need time to think," Clara said finally, though Luke could see that her thinking had already begun. That wheels were turning in her mind as she considered possibilities that had been invisible just moments before. "Of course," Luke agreed. "But Clara, while you're thinking, remember this, you're not alone anymore. You have allies, you have resources, and most importantly, you have rights that no one can take away from you." As Luke prepared to leave, tucking the document safely back into his jacket, he saw Clara standing taller than he'd ever seen her stand before. The knowledge of her true circumstances had already begun to transform her, awakening a strength that had been dormant but never destroyed. The original land deed was more than just a legal document. It was proof that Clara had never been as powerless as she'd been led to believe, that the foundation of her suffering had been built on lies that could be exposed and overcome. Whether she chose to act on that knowledge would determine not just her future, but the future of her children and the kind of legacy she would leave for generations to come. The truth was out now, dangerous and liberating in equal measure, waiting for Clara to decide whether knowledge alone was enough or whether she was ready to transform that knowledge into action that could change everything. Luke's loaded rifle rested against the wall of his ranch house study, its polished barrel catching the lamplight as he and Clara sat across from each other at his heavy oak table, plotting the most dangerous conversation of her life. The weapon wasn't meant as a threat, but as a promiser, silent assurance that he would protect her and the children from whatever violence Ezra might unleash when confronted with the truth about his crimes. Luke had seen too many men like Ezra, had witnessed how they reacted when their carefully constructed lies began to crumble, to approach this situation without preparation for the worst possible outcome. "The law is on your side," Thomas Hartwell said from his position near the window, where he could watch the road leading to Luke's property. "But the law can't protect you from a man's immediate reaction to being exposed. We need to control the circumstances, choose the time and place, have witnesses present who can testify to what happens." Clara nodded, though her hands trembled slightly as she reviewed the legal documents that would transform her from victim to property owner in the span of a single conversation. 3 days had passed since Luke's revelation about the forged deed, 3 days during which Clara had wrestled with the magnitude of her choices and their potential consequences. The knowledge that she owned the land had changed everything about how she saw her circumstances, but it had also made every interaction with Ezra feel like walking across ice that might crack at any moment. "He's been suspicious," Clara said quietly, her voice carrying the strain of maintaining normalcy while planning revolution. "He knows something has changed. Yesterday, he accused me of acting uppity, said I was walking around like I had secrets he ought to know about." Luke's jaw tightened at the description of Ezra's increasing paranoia. The man's instincts might be clouded by alcohol, but they weren't completely destroyed. He could sense the shift in Clara's demeanor, the way knowledge had begun to restore her natural dignity and self-possession. The more Clara remembered who she really was, the harder it would become to maintain the illusion of helpless dependence that Ezra required. "That's why we need to act soon," Thomas observed, his legal mind working through the tactical considerations. "The longer we wait, the more unstable he's likely to become. And if he somehow discovers what we've learned, he might take drastic action, to prevent you from asserting your rights." The phrase, drastic action, hung in the air with ominous weight. Everyone in the room understood that a man who had built his entire identity on fraud and dominance might choose violence rather than exposure, might prefer to destroy what he couldn't control, rather than face the humiliation of being revealed as a thief and a liar. "The twins," Clara said, her protective instincts never far from the surface. "Whatever we do, however we approach this, I won't put Mary and Samuel in danger. They've suffered enough." "Which is why we're going to do this at the sheriff's office," Luke said firmly. "Public space, legal authority present, witnesses to ensure that Ezra can't claim later that he was coerced or threatened. We'll present the evidence, file the formal complaint, and let the law take its course." Clara stared down at the original deed, her father's signature a reminder of the legacy that had been stolen from her and her children. What if he doesn't come? What if he refuses to cooperate with the sheriff's summons? "Then the sheriff will come to him," Thomas replied. "And that conversation will happen with considerably less consideration for Ezra's dignity or reputation. Better to give him the chance to respond to the evidence in a controlled environment." Luke stood and moved to the window, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of approaching riders. They'd sent word to Sheriff Morrison that morning, asking him to summon Ezra for a legal matter involving property disputes. The message had been deliberately vague, designed to pique Ezra's curiosity without revealing the true nature of the accusations he would face. "Are you ready for this, Clara?" Luke asked, turning back to face the woman who had become the center of his thoughts and concerns over the past months. "Once we start this process, there's no going back to the way things were. Even if you choose not to press criminal charges, even if you decide to work out some kind of arrangement with Ezra, he'll know that you know the truth. That knowledge will change everything between you." Clara lifted her chin with a determination that reminded Luke of the steel beneath her gentle exterior. "I've been ready for 20 years, she said. "I just didn't know what I was getting ready for." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their planning session, and Luke moved quickly to the rifle, not to threaten, but to be prepared for whatever might come. Through the window, they could see Sheriff Morrison riding up the path to the ranch house, his badge glinting in the afternoon sunlight, and his expression suggesting he took this summons seriously. "Mrs. Whitfield," the sheriff said as he entered Luke's study, removing his hat in deference to Clara's presence. "Mr. Callahan, Thomas. I've sent word to Ezra as requested. He'll be here within the hour, though I have to say he wasn't pleased about being summoned to discuss what he called private family business." Luke exchanged glances with Thomas, both men understanding that Ezra's resistance to official involvement suggested he suspected the nature of the charges he might face. A man with nothing to hide wouldn't object to clarifying property ownership in the presence of legal authorities. "Did he ask what this was about?" Clara inquired, her voice steadier than Luke had expected. "He did," Sheriff Morrison replied. "I told him it concerned documentation related to the Whitfield property. He said there must be some mistake, that he'd handled all the legal matters properly when he inherited the land through marriage." The sheriff's words confirmed what they'd suspected Ezra had been telling everyone in town, that Clara's inheritance had automatically become his property through marriage, perpetuating the lie that had allowed him to maintain control for 2 decades. His confidence in that story might actually work in their favor, making it harder for him to adjust his narrative when confronted with contradictory evidence. "Sheriff," Thomas said, laying out the documents on Luke's table, "before Ezra arrives, I'd like you to examine these materials so you understand what we're alleging." For the next 30 minutes, Sheriff Morrison studied the original deed, the forged quitclaim, and Thomas's analysis of the signatures and notarization. His expression grew increasingly grim as he absorbed the implications of what appeared to be a clear case of fraud that had gone undetected for 20 years. "This is serious business," the sheriff said finally. "If these allegations can be proven, we're talking about multiple felonies: fraud, forgery, theft by deception. Ezra could face significant prison time." Clara felt her stomach tighten at the mention of prison, though she wasn't sure whether the sensation was fear or relief. Part of her recoiled from the idea of being responsible for Ezra's incarceration, but another part recognized that his crimes deserved consequences, that justice required more than simply reclaiming her property. "What happens to the children if Ezra is arrested?" Clara asked, her practical mind working through the logistics of a future she'd barely dared to imagine. "The children stay with their mother," Luke said firmly, "on their mother's property, protected by their mother's legal rights and supported by friends who care about their welfare." The words carried promise and commitment that made Clara's chest tighten with emotion she'd almost forgotten how to feel. For 20 years, she'd been told that her children were burdens, complications that made her less valuable as a wife and more expensive to maintain as a dependent. The idea that they could be seen as blessings, as the center of a life worth building rather than obstacles to be endured, felt revolutionary. The sound of hoofbeats on the road announced Ezra's arrival, and Luke moved instinctively closer to Clara, his presence a reminder that she was no longer alone in facing her husband's anger. Sheriff Morrison positioned himself near the door, his hand resting casually on his gun belt in a gesture that was both subtle and unmistakable. "Remember," Thomas said quietly to Clara, "you don't have to prove anything to him. The evidence speaks for itself. Your job is simply to be present while the law takes its course." Clara nodded, though her heart was hammering against her ribs as Ezra's familiar footsteps approached the porch. 20 years of conditioning couldn't be overcome in a single moment of decision, and despite her legal rights and moral certainty, she still felt the automatic fear response that Ezra's presence had trained into her nervous system. The door opened without ceremony, and Ezra strode into Luke's study with the aggressive confidence of a man who believed he held all the advantages. His eyes swept the room, taking in the assembled group with obvious suspicion and growing hostility. "What's this about?" Ezra demanded, his gaze lingering on Clara with an expression that promised retribution for whatever presumption had brought them to this moment. "I was told there were questions about property documentation, but this looks more like an ambush." "Please sit down, Ezra," Sheriff Morrison said calmly, gesturing toward the chair that had been positioned across from Clara. "We have some documents we'd like you to examine." Ezra remained standing, his posture radiating the kind of defensive aggression that Luke recognized as the precursor to violence. "I'll stand, thanks, and I'll ask again, what's this about? What gives any of you the right to summon me like some kind of criminal?" Thomas stepped forward, his lawyer's training allowing him to maintain professional calm in the face of Ezra's hostility. "Mr. Whitfield, we've discovered some discrepancies in the property ownership records for your homestead. We'd like to give you the opportunity to explain these discrepancies before we proceed with formal legal action." The phrase, formal legal action, hit Ezra like a physical blow, and Clara saw his face cycle through confusion, recognition, and mounting rage as he began to understand the true nature of this gathering. His eyes found the document spread across Luke's table, and she watched him realize that his carefully constructed lie was about to collapse. "Those are private papers," Ezra said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "You have no right to be examining my family's business." "Actually," Clara said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised even her, "they're my papers, and it's my business, my land, my inheritance from my father." The words hung in the air like a challenge that couldn't be withdrawn, and Clara saw Ezra's face transform as he realized that his wife, his supposedly powerless, dependent wife, had somehow discovered the truth about his crimes and found the courage to confront him with it. The rifle stood ready against the wall. Sheriff Morrison's hand remained near his weapon, and Thomas had his legal arguments prepared for whatever came next. But in this moment, the most important preparation was Clara's own readiness to stand firm in the truth, to claim her rights regardless of the consequences, to prove that some things' dignity, justice, the welfare of her children were worth fighting for, no matter how dangerous the fight might become. The climax was building like a storm on the horizon, and everyone in the room could feel the electricity in the air as 20 years of lies prepared to collide with the inescapable force of truth. The sheriff's badge caught the lamplight as Morrison stepped forward, his presence suddenly filling the room with the weight of legal authority that could no longer be ignored or dismissed. For 20 years, Ezra had operated outside the boundaries of law and decency, secure in the knowledge that his crimes were hidden and his victims were too isolated to seek help. But now, faced with evidence of his fraud and the testimony of witnesses who could no longer be intimidated into silence, he found himself confronting consequences he'd never imagined possible. "Ezra Whitfield," Sheriff Morrison said, his voice carrying the formal gravity of official proceedings, "you're under arrest for fraud, forgery, and theft by deception. You have the right to remain silent, and anything you say can be used against you in a court of law." The words hit Ezra like physical blows, each charge a nail in the coffin of the identity he'd constructed around his fraudulent authority. Clara watched her husband's face cycle through disbelief, rage, and something that might have been fear, as he realized that his carefully guarded secrets had been exposed and his power had evaporated in the span of a single conversation. "This is ridiculous," Ezra snarled, his hands clenching into fists as he looked around the room for someone to blame, someone to attack, some way to reassert control over a situation that had spiraled completely beyond his influence. "You can't arrest me based on the word of a woman who doesn't understand legal matters. Clara doesn't know what she's talking about." "Actually," Thomas Hartwell said calmly, spreading the incriminating documents across Luke's table where everyone could see them clearly, "Mrs. Whitfield's testimony is supported by substantial physical evidence. The original deed establishing her ownership, the forged quitclaim bearing her falsified signature, and expert analysis of the handwriting and notarization." Ezra's eyes fixed on the papers with the horrified fascination of a man watching his life's work crumble into dust. The forged deed that had been his insurance policy, his guarantee of continued control, now looked pathetically obvious in its deception. The signature that had passed unchallenged for 2 decades couldn't survive professional scrutiny, and the notarization that had given his fraud the appearance of legitimacy proved to be as false as everything else about his claim to ownership. "I never," Ezra began, then stopped, realizing that any denial would only provide additional evidence against him. His lawyer's instincts, dormant but not entirely destroyed by years of alcohol and arrogance, warned him that every word he spoke could be twisted and used to strengthen the case against him. "You never what, Ezra?" Clara asked, her voice carrying a strength that seemed to surprise everyone in the room, including herself. "Never forged my signature, never stole my inheritance, never spent 20 years making me believe I was worthless and dependent when this was my land all along." The transformation in Clara's voice and bearing was remarkable to witness. The frightened, apologetic woman who had accepted abuse as the price of survival was gone, replaced by someone who had rediscovered her own worth and was prepared to fight for it. Luke felt his heart swell with admiration for her courage, even as his hand moved instinctively closer to the rifle that stood ready against the wall. "Clara," Ezra said, his voice dropping to the dangerous whisper that had always preceded his worst behavior, "you don't understand what you're doing. You don't understand the consequences of this betrayal." "Betrayal?" Clara's laugh held a note of genuine amazement. "You're going to talk to me about betrayal after stealing my inheritance and forcing me to sleep in a hog pen on my own property?" The words hung in the air like an indictment that couldn't be challenged or explained away. Even Ezra, practiced as he was in rationalizing his behavior, couldn't find a way to justify the systematic cruelty he'd inflicted on his family. The moral bankruptcy of his actions was laid bare for everyone to see. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward with the iron shackles that would formalize Ezra's arrest, but Ezra backed away with the desperate energy of a cornered animal. His eyes darted around the room, searching for escape routes or weapons, calculating the odds of fighting his way out of a situation that logic told him was hopeless. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," Morrison warned, his hand moving to his gun belt in a gesture that was both cautious and determined. You're already facing serious charges. Resisting arrest will only make things worse." "Worse?" Ezra's voice cracked with the strain of maintaining his composure in the face of complete humiliation. "How could things be worse? My wife has destroyed my reputation, stolen my property, turned the law against me based on lies and forged documents. The only forged documents here are the ones bearing your handiwork," Thomas said firmly, holding up the falsified quitclaim deed. "And the only lies are the ones you've been telling for 20 years about owning property that was never yours to claim." Luke watched Ezra's face as the full weight of his situation finally penetrated his alcohol-clouded reasoning. There would be no talking his way out of this confrontation, no intimidating Clara into withdrawing her accusations, no returning to the comfortable dynamic where his word was law and her suffering was acceptable. The reckoning he'd spent 2 decades avoiding had finally arrived. "The children," Ezra said suddenly, his voice taking on a note of desperate cunning. "Mary and Samuel, they need their father. You can't destroy their family over ancient paperwork and legal technicalities." Clara's expression hardened at this attempt to use her maternal instincts against her. "My children need safety, dignity, and a mother who isn't afraid to protect them. They need to see that wrong actions have consequences, that justice exists even when it takes time to arrive. And they need to know," Luke added quietly, "that good people will stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult." Ezra's gaze swung toward Luke with the full force of his hatred and resentment. Here was the man who had interfered in his family's business, who had given Clara ideas above her station, who had provided the resources and support necessary to challenge his authority. In Ezra's mind, Luke represented everything that had gone wrong, every force that had conspired to destroy his carefully maintained control. "This is your doing," Ezra accused, his voice rising to a pitch that suggested imminent violence. "You filled her head with romantic notions, made her think she deserved better than what she had. She was content before you came along with your money and your influence." "Content?" Clara's voice carried a note of disbelief that cut through Ezra's accusations like a blade. "You think I was content, sleeping in a hog pen? Content watching my children accept degradation as normal? Content living in fear of your moods and your belt?" The questions hung in the air unanswered because they were unanswerable. No rational person could claim that Clara had been content with her circumstances. No honest observer could suggest that her situation had been acceptable. Ezra's ability to rationalize his behavior had finally reached its limits. Sheriff Morrison moved forward again with the shackles, his patience with Ezra's resistance clearly exhausted. "Enough talking. You're under arrest, and you're coming with me whether you cooperate or not." Ezra's hand moved toward his belt, where he still carried the leather strap that had been his instrument of control for so many years. But Luke was faster, his own hand closing around Ezra's wrist with the iron grip of a man who had spent decades handling difficult cattle and difficult men. "Don't," Luke said quietly, his voice carrying the unmistakable threat of violence held carefully in check. "Don't make this worse than it already is." For a moment, the 2 men stood locked in a contest of wills and strength, Ezra's alcohol-fueled rage warring against Luke's disciplined restraint. Then Morrison stepped between them, the authority of his badge and his weapon, ending the confrontation before it could escalate into open violence. The shackles closed around Ezra's wrists with a sound that seemed to echo through the room like the closing of a chapter that had lasted far too long. The man who had terrorized his family through fraud and intimidation was reduced to a prisoner whose power existed only in memory. "Clara," Ezra said as Morrison began to lead him toward the door, his voice carrying a note of pleading that she'd never heard before. "Clara, please, think about what you're doing. Think about the scandal, the gossip, the damage to our children's reputation." Clara looked at her husband truly, looked at him for what felt like the first time in years. She saw not the imposing figure who had dominated her life through fear and manipulation, but a broken man whose crimes had finally caught up with him. She felt pity for him, but she also felt something more important, the complete absence of fear. "I'm thinking about giving my children a chance to grow up with dignity," Clara said quietly. "I'm thinking about teaching them that truth matters, that justice exists, that people who do wrong things face consequences for their actions." As Sheriff Morrison led Ezra toward the door, Clara felt 20 years of accumulated tension begin to drain from her body. The confrontation she'd feared for so long was over, and she was still standing. More than standing, she was free in ways she'd forgotten were possible. The badge on Morrison's chest caught the lamplight one final time as he paused at the threshold. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said formally, "you'll need to come to town tomorrow to sign the formal complaint and complete the paperwork. But for tonight, you can rest, knowing that justice is finally being served." As the sound of their footsteps faded into the distance, Clara remained standing in Luke's study, her legs trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline and emotion. The confrontation that had shaped her fears for 20 years was over, concluded not with the violence she'd always expected, but with the quiet authority of law and justice finally asserting themselves. "It's done," she whispered, though the words felt too simple to encompass the magnitude of what had just occurred. "After all these years, it's finally done." Luke moved to her side, his presence steady and reassuring as she processed the reality of her new circumstances. "The hardest part is over," he said gently. "Everything from here forward is about building the life you and the children deserve." Clara nodded, though she could barely comprehend the idea of a life built on choice rather than survival, on hope rather than fear. For the first time in decades, tomorrow held possibility instead of dread, and the weight of that freedom was almost overwhelming in its intensity. Clara's wedding ring slid from her finger with surprising ease, as if 20 years of marriage had worn away not just the gold's luster, but also its power to bind her to promises that had been broken beyond repair. She stood in the courthouse steps in Millbrook, the afternoon sun warming her face as she held the simple band that had once symbolized love and commitment, but had become a shackle that kept her chained to a life of fear and degradation. The legal proceedings had been swift and decisive. Judge Harrison, a man who had known Clara's father and remembered the kind of woman she'd been before marriage had diminished her, had listened to the evidence with growing anger at the systematic fraud that had been perpetrated against one of the county's most respected families. The forged deed was so obviously falsified that Ezra's lawyer had advised him to plead guilty to reduce charges rather than face the humiliation of a trial that would only emphasize the extent of his deception. "Mrs. Whitfield," Judge Harrison had said as he signed the order restoring her property rights, "I want you to know that this court recognizes the injustice you've suffered and the courage you've shown in seeking redress. Your father would be proud of the strength you've demonstrated." Now, standing outside the courthouse with Luke beside her and the twins playing on the grass nearby, Clara felt the full weight of her transformation from victim to victor. The woman who had slept in a hog pen because she believed she had no choice had become the rightful owner of 200 acres of prime Texas farmland, the inheritor of a legacy that stretched back 3 generations. "What will you do with it?" Luke asked, nodding toward the ring that Clara still held in her open palm. The question carried layers of meaning. What would she do with the ring, with her freedom, with the property that was now undeniably hers, with the future that stretched ahead like an unwritten book? Clara closed her fingers around the ring, feeling its familiar weight one final time before making her decision. With emotion that felt both solemn and liberating, she drew back her arm and threw the ring as far as she could into the creek that ran behind the courthouse. The small circle of gold disappeared beneath the water with barely a splash, but the symbolic weight of the gesture resonated through Clara's entire being. "I'm going to build the life my children deserve," Clara said, her voice carrying a certainty that had been absent for 20 years. "I'm going to restore the land my father loved, create a home where dignity and kindness are the foundation, and prove that it's never too late to choose hope over fear." Luke's smile was warm with admiration and something deeper in emotion that Clara was only beginning to recognize and trust. And would there be room in that life for someone who spent the last months falling in love with your courage, your strength, and your gentle heart? The proposal was unexpected in its timing, but not in its sentiment. Clara had been aware of Luke's growing feelings, just as she'd been aware of her own gradual awakening to the possibility of love that was based on respect rather than dominance, partnership rather than submission, joy rather than mere survival. "Mr. Callahan," Clara said, her voice carrying a note of gentle teasing that would have been impossible during her marriage to Ezra. "Are you asking me to marry you on the courthouse steps where I just finalized my divorce?" "I'm asking you to consider the possibility," Luke replied, his own voice warm with affection and hope. "When you're ready, when the time feels right, when you've had a chance to discover who you are as a free woman. I'm asking you to remember that love doesn't have to be painful, that marriage doesn't have to be a prison, that partnership can be a source of strength rather than surrender." Clara looked at Mary and Samuel, who had abandoned their game and were watching the adult conversation with the intense curiosity of children who understood that important decisions were being made. They had witnessed their mother's transformation from frightened victim to empowered woman, and she could see in their faces the beginning of hope that their own futures might hold possibilities they'd never dared to imagine. "What do you think?" Clara asked the twins, including them in the decision because they had earned the right to have their voices heard in matters that would affect their lives. "Should we consider Mr. Callahan's offer?" Mary stepped forward with the directness that had always characterized her personality. "Will he be kind to us? Will he let us live in the house instead of outside?" The questions pierced Clara's heart with their simple honesty, their revelation of how low the twins' expectations had fallen during their years of mistreatment. That a 7-year-old child would need to ask for basic kindness and shelter showed how completely Ezra had distorted their understanding of normal family relationships. "He will be very kind to you," Clara said with absolute certainty. "And you will never, ever have to sleep anywhere but in your own beds, in your own rooms, in the house that belongs to us." Samuel spoke next, his 8-year-old wisdom cutting to the heart of the matter with uncomfortable precision. "Will you be happy, Mama? Really happy, not just pretending happy?" The question forced Clara to confront the reality of how much her children had observed during the years when she'd thought she was successfully hiding her pain from them. They had seen through her attempts to maintain normalcy, had recognized the difference between genuine joy and the careful performance she'd maintained to protect them from the full truth of their circumstances. "Yes, sweetheart," Clara said, kneeling down to meet Samuel's eyes directly. "I believe I will be happy, really, truly happy, in ways I haven't been since before you were born." Luke knelt beside them, his presence humble rather than imposing as he addressed the children who would become his stepchildren if Clara accepted his proposal. "Mary, Samuel, I want you to know that I would consider myself honored to be part of your family. I can't replace your father, and I wouldn't try to, but I can promise to treat you with the respect and love that every child deserves." Mary reached out and took Luke's hand with the trust that children reserved for adults who had proven themselves worthy of confidence. "Will you teach me to ride horses?" she asked, her question revealing dreams that had been hidden during years when such possibilities seemed impossibly distant. "I will teach you everything you want to learn," Luke promised, his voice thick with emotion at her easy acceptance. "Riding, roping, reading the weather, caring for animals, whatever interests you and brings you joy." Samuel was more cautious, his experiences having taught him to be wary of adult promises that might not be kept. "What if you change your mind? What if you decide you don't want a ready-made family?" Luke's answer was immediate and heartfelt. "Samuel, I've been alone for 5 years since my wife died, and I thought I would spend the rest of my life that way. But meeting your mother and you children has shown me that love can come in many forms, that families can be built through choice as well as blood, that sometimes the most precious gifts are the ones we never expected to receive." Clara felt tears threaten as she watched Luke interact with her children, seeing in his gentle patience the kind of father they had never had but always deserved. The contrast with Ezra's treatment was so stark that it highlighted how abnormal their previous life had been, how much healing would be required to help the twins trust that kindness was permanent rather than temporary. "There's something else you should know," Clara said, her voice carrying a note of seriousness that made everyone pay attention. "I'm not the same woman I was when I married Ezra. 20 years of struggle have changed me in ways that can't be undone. I'm stronger now, but I'm also more careful about trusting. I'm more protective of my children and more aware of my own worth. If you marry me, you're marrying someone who will never again accept less than she deserves." Luke's smile was radiant with approval and affection. "Clara Whitfield, I wouldn't want you any other way. The woman who survived what you've survived, who found the courage to reclaim her rights, who protected her children through impossible circumstances, that's the woman I've fallen in love with. That's the woman I want to spend the rest of my life supporting and cherishing." The proposal that followed was simple and sincere, offered on bended knee in front of the courthouse where Clara had reclaimed her identity and her freedom. Luke's ring was a simple band of gold that caught the afternoon sunlight and reflected it back like a promise of brighter days ahead. "Clara May Whitfield," Luke said formally, "will you do me the honor of becoming my wife, my partner, and the mother of our combined family? Will you trust me to love you as you deserve to be loved, to protect what you've built, and to help you create the future you want for yourself and your children?" Clara looked around at the scene, the courthouse where justice had finally been served. The children who were watching with hope and trust in their eyes. The man who knelt before her, offering not rescue but partnership, not salvation but love. For the first time in 20 years, she was completely free to choose her own path, and the choice felt both momentous and utterly natural. "Yes," Clara said, her voice ringing clear across the courthouse square. "Yes, I will marry you, Luke Callahan, and I will trust you to help me build the kind of life where love is stronger than fear, where kindness is the foundation of everything we do, and where our children can grow up believing that they deserve all the happiness the world has to offer." As Luke slipped the ring onto Clara's finger, replacing the symbol of bondage with one of freely chosen commitment, the twins cheered with the pure joy of children who understood that their long ordeal was truly over. The wedding would come later, formal and proper, and witnessed by the community that had watched Clara's transformation with growing admiration. But the real marriage, the joining of hearts and hopes and dreams, happened in that moment, on the courthouse steps, witnessed by the Texas sun and sealed with the kiss of two people who had found in each other the missing pieces of their own souls. The new family photograph sat in a place of honor on the mantelpiece of the restored Whitfield home, its silver frame catching the light from windows that now stayed clean and curtains that hung straight and proud. In the image, Clara stood radiant in her simple white wedding dress, flanked by Luke in his best suit and the twins in clothes that actually fit their growing bodies. Mary held a bouquet of wildflowers picked from the very creek where Clara had once hidden her hopes, while Samuel clutched a carved wooden horsenot, his grandfather's original, which held a place of honor on his bedroom shelf, but a new one crafted by Luke's own hands as a wedding gift and symbol of the adventures that lay ahead. 6 months had passed since the wedding, 6 months that had transformed not just Clara's circumstances, but her very understanding of what life could offer when built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine affection. The house that had once echoed with tension and fear now rang with laughter and the comfortable sounds of a family that truly enjoyed each other's company. The kitchen table where Ezra had nursed his grievances and his bottle now served as the center for homework sessions, meal planning, and the gentle negotiations that came with blending two lives into one harmonious whole. Clara stood at that same kitchen window now, watching Luke teach Mary to rope a fence post, while Samuel practiced the riding skills that had become his passion and his pride. The sight filled her with a contentment so profound that she sometimes had to pinch herself to believe it was real. This was her life now, not a dream or a temporary reprieve, but the actual daily reality of a woman who had chosen courage over resignation and found that the world was capable of responding to that choice, with unexpected generosity. "Mrs. Callahan," Luke called from the yard, using the name that still made Clara smile every time she heard it. "Samuel wants to know if he can take Thunder down to the creek for a drink." "Tell him yes," Clara called back, "but to stay where we can see him." It was a different kind of watchfulness than she'd practiced during the years, with Ezra not the hyper-vigilant monitoring of a mother, protecting her children from their own father's unpredictable moods, but the natural caution of parents who wanted their children to explore and grow while remaining safe. Samuel had blossomed under Luke's patient instruction, developing not just riding skills, but the confidence that came from having a man in his life who saw his potential rather than his inadequacies. Mary had undergone her own transformation, trading the premature seriousness of a child forced to grow up too quickly for the natural exuberance of a girl who knew she was cherished and protected. Her laughter, once a rare and precious sound, now filled the house with the music that every childhood should contain. She'd started school in Millbrook, where her intelligence and eagerness to learn had quickly made her a favorite among the teachers who remembered her mother's own scholarly promise. The restoration of the property had become a community effort, with neighbors who had watched Clara's suffering in helpless sympathy now eager to contribute to her recovery. The house that had grown shabby under Ezra's neglect now gleamed with fresh paint and careful repairs. The fields that had produced more weeds than crops were showing green shoots of promise under Luke's experienced management and Clara's remembered knowledge of her father's farming methods. But perhaps the most significant change was in Clara herself, in the way she moved through the world with the quiet confidence of a woman who knew her own worth and insisted that others recognize it as well. She'd taken on the role of the town's unofficial advocate for families in distress, using her own experience to help other women recognize the signs of abuse and find the courage to seek help. Her story had become a beacon of hope for those who thought their circumstances were unchangeable, proof that justice might be delayed but was not necessarily denied. The legal aftermath of Ezra's crimes had unfolded with satisfying swiftness. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of a public trial that would expose the full extent of his deception, he had accepted a plea agreement that included 3 years in prison and the forfeiture of any claim to the property he had fraudulently controlled. The judge had been particularly harsh in his sentencing remarks, noting that crimes against family members deserved especially severe punishment because they violated the most fundamental bonds of trust and protection. Clara had felt no joy in Ezra's imprisonment, but she had felt a deep sense of closure, knowing that his actions had been officially condemned and that other potential victims had been warned about the consequences of such behavior. Justice was not revenge, it was the community's way of affirming that some actions were intolerable and that those who committed them would be held accountable. Thomas Hartwell had handled the legal complexities with professional skill and personal dedication, ensuring that Clara's property rights were fully restored and protected against any future challenges. The forged documents had been officially invalidated, and new deeds had been filed that clearly established Clara's ownership and her right to transfer, sell, or bequeath the property as she saw fit. More importantly, Clara had used the legal process as an opportunity to establish trust funds for Mary and Samuel, ensuring that they would have the educational opportunities that had been denied to their mother and that their inheritance would be protected against any future misfortunes. Luke had contributed his own resources to these funds, but he had insisted that they be structured to preserve Clara's independence and decision-making authority. The children should know that their security comes from their mother's wisdom and their own efforts. Luke had said when Clara had tried to thank him for his generosity, "What I can provide is support and partnership, not salvation. You've already saved yourself and them through your own courage." The insight revealed Luke's understanding of what Clara needed, most not rescue from a stronger person, but recognition of her own strength and the resources to exercise it effectively. Their marriage was built on that understanding, on the principle that love was strongest when it empowered rather than diminished, when it multiplied possibilities rather than restricting them. The sound of approaching horses interrupted Clara's reverie, and she looked up to see Sheriff Morrison riding up the path with a young woman Clara didn't immediately recognize. The sheriff's visits had become routine, part of his informal check on the family's welfare and his professional satisfaction at seeing justice properly served. But the presence of a stranger suggested this might be more than a social call. "Mrs. Callahan," Sheriff Morrison called as he dismounted, "I'd like you to meet Sarah Beth Wilson. She's come down from Dallas with a story I think you'll want to hear." Clara stepped onto the porch, her natural hospitality overcoming any curiosity about the woman's purpose. Sarah Beth was perhaps 25, well-dressed, but carrying herself with the careful posture Clara recognized as belonging to someone who had learned to be cautious around strangers. "Mrs. Callahan," Sarah Beth said, her voice carrying the educated accent of someone who had received proper schooling. "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I've come to thank you for what you've done, and to tell you how your courage has changed my life." Clara invited them both inside, sensing that this conversation would require privacy and comfort. As they settled around the kitchen table, Sarah Beth's story emerged a tale that was both heartbreakingly familiar and powerfully different from Clara's own experience. Sarah Beth had been married to a man who controlled her through financial manipulation rather than physical violence, who had isolated her from family and friends while maintaining a public facade of respectability. When she had read about Clara's case in the Dallas newspapers, she had recognized her own situation and found the courage to investigate her own legal rights. "Your story showed me that I wasn't crazy, that what was happening to me wasn't normal or acceptable," Sarah Beth explained, her hands wrapped around the cup of coffee Clara had provided. "If you could find the strength to challenge a man who had physically abused you, then I could find the strength to challenge someone who was only stealing my money and my dignity." The phrase, "only stealing," revealed how completely Sarah Beth had internalized the hierarchy of abuse that made emotional and financial crimes seem less serious than physical violence. Clara recognized the mindset because she had lived it herself, minimizing her own suffering because it could have been worse, accepting degradation because others endured beatings. "No one has the right to steal your dignity," Clara said firmly. "No one has the right to make you feel worthless or trapped or grateful for basic human decency. What you've suffered matters, and you deserve justice just as much as anyone else." Sarah Beth's eyes filled with tears at the validation, and Clara understood that this conversation was as much about her own healing as it was about helping another woman. By sharing her story, by standing as living proof that escape was possible, Clara was transforming her suffering into purpose and her survival into inspiration. The afternoon lengthened as Sarah Beth shared the details of her own legal victory: property reclaimed, assets restored, and a husband who now faced charges for his fraudulent schemes. Sheriff Morrison listened with professional interest, taking notes that might help him identify similar cases in his own jurisdiction. "The pattern is more common than we realized," Morrison observed. "Men who use legal manipulation instead of physical force, who hide behind respectability while systematically destroying their wives' independence. Your case has opened our eyes to crimes we might have overlooked in the past." As Sarah Beth prepared to leave, she pressed a small wrapped package into Clara's hands. "This is for you," she said, "a small token of gratitude from someone whose life you've saved without even knowing it." Clara unwrapped the package to reveal a delicate silver locket, its surface engraved with wildflowers that reminded her of the pressed blooms in her mother's Bible. Inside was a photograph of Sarah Beth with two small children, their faces bright with the hope of a secure future. "They're beautiful," Clara said, studying the image of a family that had been rescued by courage, borrowed from a stranger's example. "They will grow up knowing that their mother fought for their rights," Sarah Beth replied. "They will grow up believing that justice is possible, that good people will stand up for what's right, that love is stronger than fear. You gave me the ability to give them that gift." As Sheriff Morrison and Sarah Beth rode away, Clara remained on the porch, watching the sun set over land that belonged to her and her children. surrounded by the sounds of a family that was healing and growing stronger with each passing day. Luke's voice carried from the barn where he was teaching Samuel the finer points of horse care, while Mary's laughter drifted from the garden where she was helping to plant the vegetables that would feed them through the coming winter. The photograph on the mantelpiece captured a moment in time, but it also represented something larger, the triumph of hope over despair, of courage over resignation, of love over fear. Clara had become more than a survivor. She had become a symbol of what was possible when people refused to accept injustice as permanent, when they chose to fight for the lives they deserved rather than settling for the lives they were given. Standing in the doorway of her restored home, surrounded by the evidence of what love and determination could accomplish, Clara offered a silent prayer of gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this moment. The woman who had once slept among pigs had reclaimed not just her property, but her dignity, not just her freedom, but her joy, not just her survival, but her power to help others find their own paths to liberation. The stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, each one a point of light in the vastness that reminded Clara of all the possibilities that still lay ahead. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to build the kind of life that honored the struggles of the past while embracing the promise of the future. But tonight, Clara Callahan stood in the doorway of her own home, listening to the voices of her beloved family, and knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The cruel husband, who had tried to break her spirit, was gone. The rich cowboy who had seen her suffering had become her partner in joy, and the woman who had once believed herself powerless had discovered that she possessed strength enough to change not just her own life, but the lives of others who needed to believe that transformation was possible. The photograph on the mantelpiece smiled back at her through the window, capturing forever the moment when hope became reality and love became the foundation for everything that would follow. It was, Clara thought, as she finally stepped inside and closed the door behind her, exactly the kind of legacy she wanted to leave for her children and for all the women who would come after her, proof that dignity could be reclaimed, that justice could be achieved, and that every person deserved a life built on respect, kindness, and the unshakable knowledge that they were worthy of love.